Chapter 2305. Night had fallen. The rolling mountains were sleeping under the night sky, quiet and gloomy. There were no stars in the sky. Only dark clouds drifted by, and the biting cold wind whistled. The glazed fire dragon carried Ji Tianqing and Yun Yao and flew over the mountains at a moderate speed. 2 whole hours passed. The two of them searched an area with a radius of 30,000 miles, but they did not find the entrance to the illusory void's secret realm. However, during the search, they encountered several groups of martial artists who were in a hurry. Those martial artists were in groups of 3 to 5. There must be 1 or 2 martial sages among them, and the rest were all tribulation transcendence experts. Even martial lords in the 5th or 6th level of the tribulation transcendence realm could only be the guards and attendants of the martial sages. Everyone knew that only martial sages were qualified to explore the illusory void's secret realm and obtain the treasures of Nangong martial god. Those tribulation transcendence realm experts were just here to join in the fun, broaden their horizons, and try their luck. Very quickly, another 4 hours passed. It was midnight. Ji Tianqing and Yun Yao searched an area with a radius of 50,000 miles, but they still did not find the target. Therefore, the glazed fire dragon temporarily stopped and floated in the clouds. Ji Tianqing and Yun Yao looked at each other and frowned in confusion. According to the news circulating outside, the entrance to the illusory void's secret realm is nearby. We have searched an area with a radius of 80,000 miles. Logically speaking, we should find it soon, right? Ji Tianqing frowned and looked around. His deep eyes shone brightly. Yun Yao nodded and comforted him gently. Don't worry. We have plenty of time. The person who finds the entrance first may not be the first to enter. Ji Tianqing thought for a moment and said, We don't have enough information. We can observe the movements of others. Maybe we can find the entrance faster. That's good. Yun Yao nodded in agreement. Then the glazed fire dragon continued to fly in the night sky. Ji Tianqing and Yun Yao checked the surroundings. At the same time, they were also paying attention to the movements of others. An hour later, a dazzling golden light flew over from afar. It rushed into the depths of the mountain range as fast as lightning. Ji Tianqing turned his head and saw a flying ship about 100 meters long wrapped in the golden light. The flying boat was in the shape of a shuttle, and its surface was engraved with mysterious patterns. Its shape was very exquisite. Without hesitation, he teleported over and turned into a ball of dazzling starlight, blocking the front of the flying boat. The flying boat that was galloping did not slow down in the slightest and directly crashed into Ji Tianqing. Seeing this, Ji Tianqing furrowed his brows. Without hesitation, he raised his right hand and struck out with a dazzling golden palm. Boom! With a muffled sound, the mountain-sized golden palm grabbed the flying boat and held it firmly in its palm. The incomparably violent impact was also neutralized by the giant golden palm. Even though the flying boat flashed with golden light and unleashed a powerful force, it was still unable to break free from the grasp of the giant palm. Ji Tianqing grabbed the flying boat back in front of him and controlled the giant palm expressionlessly. He gradually crushed the flying boat, causing it to constantly deform and shrink. If he did not stop, the flying boat would be crushed into a pile of debris in 10 breaths at most. At this moment, the door of the flying boat opened, and 2 figures hurriedly flew out. Swoosh swoosh. 2 tall and beautiful figures appeared in front of Ji Tianqing. They were 2 beautiful young girls in long green dresses. They were about 18 years old and had long black hair that draped over their shoulders like a black waterfall. What surprised Ji Tianqing the most was that the 2 young girls in green had the same appearance and eyes. They were a pair of twin sisters. The 2 young girls in green had a frosty expression. They glared at Ji Tianqing angrily, their clear eyes flashing with anger and ferocity. Hey, you bastard, why are you blocking our way? Despicable guy, we have no enmity with you. Why are you attacking us? The 2 sisters questioned at the same time. Their voices were clear and melodious, very pleasant to listen to. Even their angry rebuke had a hint of playfulness and lightness. Ji Tianqing looked at the 2 of them without changing his expression. He was about to open his mouth and explain his purpose of coming. At this moment, Yun Yao rushed over on the glazed fire dragon. She came to Ji Tianqing's side and looked at the twins with a gentle expression. She said in a calm tone, Sisters, please forgive us for disturbing you. Tianqing doesn't mean any harm. He just wants to ask you some questions. Unfortunately, you don't have any intention of stopping, so he resorted to this. Yunyao was originally a noble and elegant fairy. Now that she had been pregnant for many years, she had a bit of motherly radiance. When the twins saw her, they were stunned. When they heard her gentle words, the anger of the two sisters immediately dissipated. The two of them glared at Ji Tianqing angrily and couldn't help but mutter, "Humph, what a rude guy. How hateful. This sister is really good at talking. For her sake, we won't argue with you." Ji Tianqing almost couldn't help but roll his eyes. He thought to himself, even if Yao Yao is popular, is my popularity so bad? What do you mean by not arguing with me for her sake? You two look so weak. What do you have to argue with me? The twins were still young. They were still a little childish, and their strength was only about the third stage of the crossing calamity realm. If Ji Tianqing was a bad guy, he could kill the two of them in one move. Yunyao easily won the favor of the two sisters and started chatting with them. "Sisters, you two are so beautiful and cute. You are even twins. It's really rare in the world. What are your names? Who is the elder sister and who is the younger sister?" The two sisters answered in unison, "My name is Qingqing, and her name is Yi Qingqing. I am the elder sister, and she is the younger sister." Their voices were the same. The speed and tone of their speech were also the same. After speaking, the two of them looked at each other. They pouted unhappily and frowned. Seeing this scene, Yunyao was amused. It seems that the two of you are very interesting. May I ask, why are the two of you in such a hurry? Did something happen?" Qingqing, who was on the left, quickly nodded and said with a worried face, "Sister guessed right. We did encounter some trouble, and were in a hurry to save Master. Originally, Master brought us here to search for treasures. But on the way, Master met an enemy. She separated from us temporarily, and led the enemy away alone. Not long ago, Master sent a message saying that she defeated the enemy. But the enemy fled to the entrance of the mystic realm. The enemy's accomplices were there. Now Master is besieged by them. I don't know if she is alive or dead." When Qingqing was talking about her experience, Yi secretly gave her a look, indicating that she should not say anything. After all, the two of them were not familiar with Ji Tianqing and his wife. It was not appropriate for them to reveal their real experience. However, Yunyao's appearance, temperament, and demeanor were too fairy-like. Chapter 2306. After listening to Qingqing's words, Ji Tianqing and Yunyao looked at each other. Their master actually knows the location of the secret realm's entrance. The two of them transmitted their voices to each other at the same time and said the same thing. The two of them could see that the twin sisters were obviously inexperienced and naive. This kind of young and immature martial artist was bound to suffer all kinds of setbacks in this unpredictable world of martial arts. However, they were lucky enough to meet Ji Tianqing and Yunyao. At least, the couple would not harm the twin sisters. Yunyao said to Qingqing, "No wonder you are in such a hurry. Your master is in a tight encirclement. It is indeed worrying. My husband has damaged your flying boat, which will definitely delay your journey. How about this? Let us send the two of you to find your master. Consider it our compensation." Seeing that she took the initiative to invite them, Yi frowned and subconsciously wanted to refuse. However, Qingqing stared at the glazed fiery dragon without blinking. Her eyes were full of curiosity and expectation. She only thought for a moment and simply nodded in agreement. "Sister, since you are so kind to invite us, we will naturally accept your invitation. May I ask what kind of dragon this is? Is it your mount?" Qingqing. Yi quickly grabbed Qingqing's arm and gave her a look. She transmitted her voice to her. "Qingqing, how can you trust others so easily? Have you forgotten Master's instructions? What if these two are bad people or Master's enemies? Aren't we sending lambs to the tiger's den?" Qingqing pouted and said hesitantly, Master told us to watch more and talk less when we are outside. We can't have the intention to harm others, but we must be vigilant. However, this sister is very nice. I have carefully observed her eyes. She is definitely not a bad person. Moreover, with their strength, if they really had evil intentions, we would have been killed long ago. Why won't you listen to me?" Yi could not help but stomp her feet. She was angry and anxious. However, Qing ignored her and flew to the back of the glazed fiery dragon with Yuniao. She looked around curiously. Ji Tianqing remained silent and returned to the dragon's back. Seeing this, Yi hesitated for a long time before flying onto the dragon's back and landing beside Qing. Of course, she had been holding onto Qing's arm and was secretly guarding against Ji Tianqing. She was afraid that he would suddenly turn into a vicious thug on the way. Qing kept chatting with Yuniao. She asked all sorts of questions like a curious baby. Yuniao answered her patiently. Her expression and tone were always gentle, making people feel like they were bathing in the spring breeze. An hour later, Qing had become familiar with her and completely trusted her. She had completely let down her guard. Ji Tianqing knew that Yuniao had a natural advantage when it came to gaining the trust of others. Unlike him, who was excessively handsome and heroic, yet also extremely mysterious, which always made people doubly wary of him. Since that was the case, he decided not to interrupt and continued to look at the scenery. Very quickly 2 hours passed. Under Qing's guidance, the glazed fire dragon flew continuously for more than 70,000 miles and stopped in the sky above a large canyon. This was a huge canyon that was tens of thousands of miles long and spanned from north to south. On both sides of the canyon were towering mountain ranges that were as high as 30,000 feet, covered by a lush forest. On one side of the canyon there was a steep cliff that was tens of thousands of feet high, revealing a large area of grayish-brown rocks. The canyon was bottomless and was covered by a thick white fog, making people unable to see the situation at the bottom of the canyon. Ji Tianqing and the others stood on the dragon's back and looked down at the canyon below. Qing looked around anxiously and muttered to herself, "Master was besieged near here. I wonder how she is now and where is she?" When Ji Tianqing and Yuniao heard this, they understood that this canyon was the entrance to the illusory void mystic realm. Both of them released their divine senses and probed into the canyon to conduct a thorough search. At this time, Yi took out a communication jade slip. "Instead of worrying here, why don't we send another message to Master and ask about her specific location?" As she spoke, she was about to enter a message into the jade slip. However, Ji Tianqing, who had been silent all this while, suddenly spoke. He frowned and looked at the north end of the canyon. He said calmly, "There are powerhouses fighting 3,000 miles ahead. Let's go and take a look." Qing was instantly energized and her eyes were filled with hope. "Really? Then it's very likely that it's Master." Yi hesitated for a moment and put away the jade slip. She decided to go and take a look first. Swoosh! The glazed fire dragon flew over the canyon and turned into a golden flame, heading toward the north. In just a few minutes it had flown 3,000 miles away. At this time Ji Tianqing, Yuniao, and the others could see that there were a few powerhouses fighting in the sky 100 miles ahead. There were a total of 4 people, all of whom were martial sages. However, they were divided into 2 groups. One of the groups consisted of 3 people. There was a white-haired old man, a middle-aged man with a dignified appearance, and a hideous old woman in a black robe. The 3 of them waved their Dharma treasures and weapons, casting spells that covered the sky and covered the sun. They surrounded and attacked a middle-aged woman in a dark purple dress. The middle-aged woman was not tall, and her face was a little thin. Her long hair was tied up in a high bun and she wore a green jade Taoist crown. She held a washbasin-sized jade slip in her left hand and a silver-white sword in her right hand. She was casting spells with all her might to defend herself. However, her clothes were ragged and covered in blood. Her face was also covered in blood. She looked rather pathetic. Facing the pincer attack of the 3 martial sages, she could only retreat and fight at the same time. She did not dare to fight them head-on. Her Dharma power aura was also fluctuating violently and somewhat chaotic. It was obvious that she was at the end of her rope and was only holding on with her last breath. At most, she would be defeated miserably and killed by the 3 martial sages on the spot in 15 minutes. Qing and Yi's bodies shook when they saw this scene, and they revealed a complicated expression of joy, grief, and indignation. "Master! Master, don't panic. We're here to save you," the 2 of them shouted in a crisp voice. They pulled out their swords almost at the same time and rushed out without caring about their own safety. Seeing this, Ji Tianqing immediately frowned. These 2 silly girls, How could you interfere in a battle between martial sacred realm experts? Yunyao also frowned. 2 rays of silver light shot out from her hands and turned into 2 giant palms, grabbing at Qing Qing and Yi. Swoosh! Qing Qing and Yi had just flown 1,000 feet away when they were caught by the 2 giant palms and pulled back onto the back of the glaze fire dragon. Yunyao looked at the 2 of them and said in a dignified tone, "I can understand your eagerness to save your master. However, if you rush up like this, how is it different from courting death?" Qing Qing and Yi struggled with all their might and asked anxiously, "Then what can we do? Do we just watch our master be besieged by evil people? Sister Fairy, please let us go." Chapter 2307. Qingqing and Yi were twin sisters. On the night they were born, their entire family had been exterminated by their enemies. The 2 infant sisters had fallen into a sea of fire and were about to die. At the critical moment, the Puhua martial saint had passed by and righteously saved them. Later on, the martial saint had brought them back to Mount Puhua in the East Sea, where he had personally raised them and cared for them. For 20 years, the 2 sisters had never left Mount Puhua. They had lived a carefree life isolated from the rest of the world, which had nurtured their innocent and pure personalities. This treasure hunt in the ruins of God was their first time entering the Shenwu continent, but they had never imagined that such an unfortunate calamity would befall them. They had watched with their own eyes as the Puhua martial saint was besieged by 3 villains. He was riddled with wounds and bleeding profusely. He had been beaten into a retreat, but he had been powerless to help. The 2 felt as if a knife had been twisted in their hearts, and tears welled up in their clear eyes. Ji Tianxing and Yunyao did not know the inside story. However, they could see that the 2 sisters' feelings for their master were pure and flawless, and they were as close as mother and daughter. Yunyao looked at the 2 sisters who were crying their hearts out and could not help but sigh. Then she turned to look at Ji Tianxing and said, "Tianxing, can you help them? Just treat it as compensation for them." Ji Tianxing and Yunyao were telepathically connected, so he naturally understood what she meant. She was referring to Qingqing leading the way for them to the entrance of the secret realm. "You're just too soft-hearted." Ji Tianxing smiled and nodded, looking at Yunyao with a doting gaze. As soon as he finished speaking, his figure flashed and disappeared into the sky. Whoosh! In the next instant, he teleported hundreds of kilometers away and appeared behind the 3 martial saints. Heaven-seizing palm. Ji Tianxing growled and raised his hands to unleash 2 mountain-sized golden palms that ruthlessly slammed towards the 2 martial saints. The 3 martial saints were attacking the Puhua martial saint with all their might. They only wanted to kill him as soon as possible and end the battle. They had not been on guard at all, and a stranger had actually interfered in their business. Bang bang! Following 2 muffled explosions, the white-haired old man and the black-robed old woman were struck by the giant golden palm on the spot. They spat out mouthfuls of blood and were sent flying. The 2 of them were only rank 5 martial sages and could not withstand Ji Tianxing's secret skill. They were severely injured on the spot. The 2 of them flew for 30 miles before they managed to stop in the sky, panting heavily. At the same time, the burly and dignified middle-aged man turned his head to look at Ji Tianxing. He shouted in shock and anger, "Who are you? Why are you interfering in our feud? Do you know the consequences of offending the Sunset Alliance?" Ji Tianxing glanced at him and said expressionlessly, "What Sunset Alliance? I've never heard of it." As he spoke, he waved his hand and struck out a huge sword made of stars that could split the heavens and earth apart, slashing down at the middle-aged man's head. The middle-aged man's expression changed drastically, and he quickly teleported away. Shwa! In an instant he retreated 80 miles. However, the huge sword made of stars had locked onto his spiritual soul aura. It also teleported 80 miles and struck him with a bang. The middle-aged man was instantly struck until blood splattered everywhere. He fell rapidly from the sky and crashed heavily into the Grand Canyon. Bang! A loud muffled sound came from the depths of the canyon, reverberating endlessly in the canyon. The ground and the mountains on both sides trembled, and countless rocks fell. At this point, the 3 martial sages had been severely injured by Ji Tianxing. Puhua martial sage was temporarily safe. He flew to 100 steps away from Ji Tianxing and sized him up in shock. Thank you for saving us, young master. May I know your name? As he spoke, Puhua martial sage bowed to Ji Tianqing to express his gratitude. Although Ji Tianqing was very young, he had only used 3 moves to severely injure the 3 martial sages. With such terrifying strength, Puhua martial sage did not dare to underestimate him. His expression was respectful. Ji Tianqing cupped his hands and returned the greeting. He said calmly, "It's nothing. Don't mention it." Then, he pointed to the glazed fire dragon not far away and said, "Your 2 beloved disciples are very worried about your safety." Puhua martial sage turned his head to look. When he saw the glazed fire dragon's appearance, his pupils shrank and shock flashed across his eyes. He then saw Qingqing and Yi on the dragon's back. They were in a petrified state. Their eyes were wide with shock, and their small mouths were slightly agape. There was no trace of worry or anxiety on the 2 sisters' faces. There was only shock and disbelief. Very clearly, Qingqing and Yi both did not expect that Ji Tianqing was actually powerful to such an extent. In the blink of an eye, he had sent the 3 martial sages flying. It was a complete sweep, a complete suppression. Wasn't this too terrifying? Even their most respected and worshipped master was completely defeated by Ji Tianqing. Puhua martial sage glanced at Yunyao, who was beside the 2 sisters, and shock flashed across his eyes. His mind was clear, and he immediately understood that Ji Tianqing and Yunyao definitely had extraordinary identities. Moreover, it seemed that the 2 sisters had met a benefactor. At this moment, the 3 heavily injured martial sages flew over from afar. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. The 3 of them stood still in the sky 1,000 feet away. All of them had ugly expressions, and their bodies were stained with blood. The white-haired old man and the black-robed old woman's internal injuries were more serious, but they did not look miserable on the outside. The middle-aged man in the lead was in a miserable state. His entire right arm was cut off, and blood soaked his long robe. The 3 of them glared angrily at Ji Tianqing and Puhua martial sage. Their expressions were ferocious, and their entire bodies were bursting with killing intent and anger. "Puhua, I didn't expect you to hook up with such a young man at your age," the black-robed old woman shouted, full of resentment. The white-haired old man also said sinisterly, "Puhua, even if that brat can protect you for a while, he can't protect you forever. You're lucky today, but we'll settle our scores in the future. Sooner or later, your head will be separated from your body." Puhua martial sage's expression immediately turned cold, and he shouted angrily, "Black-white double demons, don't slander us. This young master only helped out because he saw injustice. You can only blame yourselves for committing so many evil deeds." The black-white double demons immediately understood that Ji Tianqing was not Puhua martial sage's backer, and they laughed sinisterly. So it's a nosy brat. Since he's not your lover, then you're dead meat. Just you wait. Our alliance will flatten Mount Puhua soon." Puhua martial sage was so angry that he clenched his fists, and his knuckles turned white. Ji Tianqing looked at the black-white double demons with an indifferent expression, and said coldly, "What you should do now is to run away with your tails between your legs and disappear from my sight. How dare you provoke me? Are you tired of living?" His deep and vigorous voice was filled with an indescribable domineering and majestic aura. The black-white double demons were also suppressed to the point that their aura turned sluggish, and they revealed looks of shame and anger. Chapter 2308. The middle-aged man's words finally infuriated Ji Tianqing. He stared coldly at the middle-aged man as his lips curled into a sneer. "Very well, you have successfully worn out my patience." As soon as he finished speaking, Ji Tianqing's figure flashed and teleported out. He turned into a silver light and charged toward the middle-aged man. Whoosh! When he arrived in front of the middle-aged man, he had turned into a giant star sword that was hundreds of feet long, bursting with invincible power. They were not far apart, and Ji Tianqing was too fast. When the giant star sword was in front of the middle-aged man, he suddenly came to his senses and hurriedly retreated. But it was all in vain. Boom! In the deafening noise, the middle-aged man's body was smashed into pieces by the giant sword and turned into a rain of flesh and blood, splashing in the sky. Among the pieces of flesh and blood, there was a blazing white divine soul. It was also cracked by the giant sword and floated in the sky in a daze. The middle-aged man's body was destroyed by Ji Tianqing, and his divine soul was severely injured. Then the giant star sword changed its direction and went toward the old woman in the black robe. The old woman in the black robe was terrified and hurriedly teleported to escape. But she had only flown for about 10 miles when the giant star sword caught up with her and hit her hard. With another muffled bang, the old woman in the black robe was also smashed into pieces of flesh and blood, scattering in the sky. The white-haired old man not far away was already scared out of his wits. He turned around and ran away in horror. He unleashed all the potential he had in his entire life, streaking across the sky as fast as he could, rushing into the white clouds. However, Ji Tianqing teleported hundreds of miles away and caught up with the white-haired old man in the blink of an eye. Swoosh! He waved his right hand and a giant golden sword that was 100 meters long appeared. Boom! The white-haired old man followed in the footsteps of his companions. His body was smashed into pieces on the spot, leaving only his divine soul floating in the sky. Only then did Ji Tianqing stop. Looking at the 3 divine souls who were fleeing in panic, he said with an expressionless face, "Today, I will spare your lives and destroy your corporeal bodies as punishment. If you let me see you again, even the gods won't be able to save you." Then he stepped across the sky and returned to the back of the glazed fire dragon. The thunderous sound waves were still reverberating in the sky, displaying an unparalleled domineering aura. The 3 balls of souls had learned their lesson. They didn't dare to linger for even a moment, nor did they dare to utter a single word. They fled to the end of the canyon in a panic. In the blink of an eye, the 3 divine souls disappeared into the horizon. It was only now that Puhua Marshal Saint regained his senses. He stared at Ji Tianqing dumbfounded, his eyes wide with shock. Just now, she was the closest to Ji Tianqing and witnessed the whole process with her own eyes. She personally felt Ji Tianqing's terrifying sword intent and mana. At this moment there was only one thought in her mind. Oh my god! Is this young master a peak martial saint or a martial god? She was a 6th degree martial saint and had seen the power and means of a peak martial saint. But she was very sure that even a 9th degree martial saint couldn't be as invincible as Ji Tianqing. After a moment, Puhua Martial Saint regained her senses. She knew that she had lost her composure and hurriedly lowered her head to cover her wound. She staggered towards the glazed fire dragon. Qingqing and Yi suppressed their shock and hurriedly went up to her. Master! Master, are you all right? The 2 of them supported Puhua Martial Saint on both sides and asked with concern. Puhua Martial Saint shook her head and said with a weak expression, "Don't worry, I can still hold on." Then she looked at Ji Tianqing and Yuniao on the dragon's back and bowed sincerely. "I'm Layman Puhua from Puhua Mountain in the Eastern Sea. Thank you for saving my life. Puhua would never forget such kindness. In the future, if you have any instructions, Puhua Mountain will go through water and tread on fire without hesitation." Qingqing and Yi bowed together with Puhua Martial Saint, their faces full of gratitude. Now in Qingqing and Yi's eyes, Ji Tianqing was no longer a fierce and dangerous villain. In the blink of an eye, he had turned into an unfathomable, powerful, and otherworldly expert. Moreover, this expert had a noble character and helped the weak. He was a great hero that was revered by all. Ji Tianqing nodded slightly and said calmly, "Layman Puhua, you're too polite. Don't worry about such trivial matters. It's not good to stay here and you're seriously injured. The most important thing now is to find a secluded place to heal as soon as possible." What he meant was that they had to leave. Puhua Martial Saint understood but still reminded him, "Young master, you haven't told me your name. If I want to repay you in the future, I don't know how to find you." Ji Tianqing shook his head and said, "There's no need to repay me. My surname is Ji and this is my wife. Her surname is Yun." Puhua Martial Saint nodded and said, "I will never forget your peerless demeanor. Young Master Ji's breadth of mind is even more admirable." As for the Sunset Alliance, Puhua still had to remind the 2 of them. The middle-aged man just now was the deputy leader of the Sunset Alliance and the black-white double ghosts were the protectors. The Sunset Alliance is the strongest martial arts organization in the Eastern Sea. It has 6 martial saints and close to 100,000 members and pirates. Although you and your wife are both otherworldly experts, The Sunset Alliance's power is not ordinary. It is also an evil sect that does all sorts of evil. The two of you have to be careful. Ji Tianqing smiled disapprovingly. They're just a bunch of useless people not worth mentioning. If they really dare to take revenge on me, they'll be digging their own graves. Puhua Marshal Saint laughed self-deprecatingly and nodded, saying, "That's right. I've worried too much. With young Master Ji's strength and methods, destroying the entire Sunset Alliance is only a matter of time." After saying that, she was about to bid farewell to Ji Tianqing and his wife. However, she hesitated and asked again, "If I'm not wrong, you and your wife are also here for the Illusory Sky Secret Realm, right?" Ji Tianqing did not hide it from her and nodded. Puhua Marshal Saint smiled and said, "The entrance to the Illusory Sky Secret Realm is 800 miles to the north, in a cave at the bottom of a canyon. However, young Master Ji must be careful. There are more than 10 groups of Marshal Saint experts gathered here. I'm afraid there will be a great battle." "Thank you for the reminder." Ji Tianqing nodded to express his gratitude. Puhua Marshal Saint did not say anything else and bowed to Ji Tianqing and Yunyao. After saying goodbye, he turned and flew away with the two sisters. On the way to the depths of the mountains, Qing kept looking back and glanced at Yunyao reluctantly. However, Ji Tianqing and Yunyao had no intention of asking her to stay. She could only leave with Puhua Marshal Saint with a heart full of disappointment and regret. After the three of them disappeared into the horizon, Ji Tianqing and Yunyao rode the glazed fire dragon and flew towards the north. Not long after, the glazed fire dragon flew 800 miles. Ji Tianqing released his divine sense into the canyon, and indeed found a cave at the bottom of the canyon. However, the strange thing was that not only was there a powerful sealing force in the cave, there were also several layers of sealing formations outside the cave. Chapter 2309. In the sky thousands of kilometers away from the Grand Canyon, Puhua Marshal Saint was flying high in the sky with Qing and Yi. She was preparing to leave the Grand Canyon, which was filled with powerhouses, and find a secluded place to heal her injuries. However, she kept frowning as she hurried along. Qing noticed that her master was a little distracted, so she asked, "Master, what are you thinking about?" As a disciple, it was somewhat inappropriate and rude for her to ask her master so directly. However, the three of them were as close as mother and daughter, so Puhua Marshal Saint did not mind. She pursed her lips and said in a low voice, "I've been thinking. That young master's strength far surpasses that of a martial saint, but he's not a martial god. Who else on this continent could be so powerful? Moreover, he claims that his surname is Ji, and his wife's surname is Yun. I've recalled some legends." Qing and Yi were very unfamiliar with the Shenwu continent, and they knew nothing about it. The two of them immediately became interested and looked at Puhua Marshal Saint expectantly. They asked Master, "What legends?" Puhua Marshal Saint hesitated for a moment before explaining, "In recent years, I've stepped into the Shenwu continent many times, and I've always heard a name called Ji Tianqing. This person is a legend in the martial world and has created many inconceivable miracles. His reputation has spread throughout the continent, and it can be said that everyone knows of him. It's said that he's young, only in his 20s, but he's already a martial saint. He's the #1 god disciple of the Luoshui Divine Kingdom, and the #1 genius of the human race. He's defeated many peak martial saints and slaughtered millions of demons." Puhua Marshal Saint told the two sisters all the legends she had heard. The two sisters listened attentively, and their expressions became more and more shocked and excited. In the end, the two of them could no longer remember how many stories Puhua Marshal Saint had told them, nor how many miracles Ji Tianqing had created. They only knew that the legendary Ji Tianqing was definitely a monstrous genius that could not be seen in 10,000 years. He was an existence comparable to a god. How could such a monstrous genius exist? After Puhua Marshal Saint finished speaking, she turned to look at the two sisters. Seeing that the two sisters were still in shock and daze, she revealed a smile and said, "Are you shocked by his various deeds? That's right, the legendary Ji Tianqing was like a god, so monstrous that it made people feel unreal. Because of this, when I faced that young Master Ji, I didn't think of those legends nor did I ask for his name. Now that he thought about it, that young Master Ji could very well be the legendary Ji Tianqing. Only a heaven-defying monster like him could possess a fairy-like beauty and have a divine dragon as his mount. Ching Ching and Yi finally came back to their senses and nodded repeatedly like chicks pecking rice. Yes, Master's guess is right. Young Master Ji is definitely Ji Tianxing. Apart from this answer, I really can't think of a second possibility. That young Master Ji's demeanor and bearing are very much in line with your description of Ji Tianxing. Master, I've always felt that young Master Ji's wife, Big Sister Yun, is very gentle. She's as perfect as a fairy. If we had known earlier, we wouldn't have left. Wouldn't it have been better if we had stayed with them? Ching Ching, how can you think like that? Big Sister Yun didn't ask you to stay. How can you have the nerve to stay by her side? The two sisters were talking all at once. Ching Ching was still regretting that she didn't have the nerve to stay. Puhua Marshal Saint looked at the two of them and shook his head with a wry smile, saying, "You two stop arguing. It's completely meaningless. Young Master Ji is willing to lend a hand and help me resolve this crisis. This is already a great favor. How can you ask for more? Moreover, young Master Ji and young Lady Yun are a fairy-like couple. What do you two look like by their side? A maid? Or a maid?" Ching Ching pouted disapprovingly and muttered in a low voice, "It's fine even if we're treated as their maid. For such powerful and perfect people like them, who knows how many people would want to be their maid?" He immediately rolled her eyes and said unhappily, "Ching Ching, can't you be a little more mature?" Puhua Marshal Saint smiled wryly again and said with a somewhat self-mocking tone, "Do important people like them need maids and maids? Moreover, the two of you are inexperienced and don't understand the ways of the world. You'll only cause trouble by following them. Alright, let's not talk about this. Let's find a place to heal first." Not long after, Puhua Marshal Saint found a remote place and began to circulate his energy to heal his injuries. Ji Tianxing and Yunyao stood on the dragon's back and looked down at the cave at the bottom of the canyon. The cave wasn't big and was only 100 feet in radius. The surroundings were full of cracks and it was obvious that it had collapsed naturally. 5-colored divine light surged in the cave, emitting a majestic and mighty aura. Outside the cave were piles of rocks. The ground and mountain walls were inlaid with magic treasures and spirit stones to maintain the operation of the formation. A layer of gold and a layer of red light shield protected the cave tightly. Other than that, Ji Tianxing also detected that there were 3 layers of ceiling formations at the cave entrance that hadn't been activated yet. There were a total of 5 layers of seals and all of them were saint-level formations. Strange, who would set up 5 layers of defensive formations here and seal the cave? Ji Tianxing couldn't help but frown after observing for a while. Yunyao said without hesitation, "It should be those martial saints who arrived first. They were afraid that others would enter the secret realm, so they did it on purpose." Ji Tianxing revealed a contemptuous sneer and said, "What's the use of setting up a seal outside the cave? If we can't break the god-level seal inside the cave, everything will be in vain." Yunyao nodded and said, "This is human nature. We don't want others to get what we can't get." Ji Tianxing raised his eyebrows and said with a playful smile, "There are only 3 groups of people here. Let's take advantage of the fact that most of the martial saints haven't found this place yet." Yunyao glanced at the 3 groups of people outside the cave and nodded, saying, "That's good too." After saying that, she put away the glazed fire dragon and followed Ji Tianxing to land among the rocks outside the cave. 2 middle-aged men stood at the entrance of the cave and stared at the defensive light shield with full concentration. They were using their divine senses to examine it carefully. Suddenly, they heard footsteps behind them. The 2 of them immediately turned around and looked sharply at Ji Tianxing and Yunyao. Seeing the 2 of them walking over, the middle-aged man in golden armor asked angrily, "What do you want?" Ji Tianxing's lips curled into a cold smile and said, "What else can people who have come here do?" The other burly man in purple robes said with a hideous smile, "Boy, you don't know the rules. Do you know what first come, first served means? You just arrived and you want to cut the queue. Don't you see that the other 2 groups of people are still waiting?" As he spoke, he pointed at the piles of rocks on both sides. There were 2 groups of people standing on top of the 2 piles of rocks. There were a total of 6 cultivators, 2 martial saints and 4 martial monarchs. They were all looking at Ji Tianxing with angry faces. Ji Tianqing immediately laughed and shouted domineeringly, "What rules? I am the rules." Chapter 23:10. The two middle-aged men obviously did not expect Ji Tianqing to be so arrogant. After being stunned for a moment, the two of them came back to their senses. Immediately they revealed hideous smiles and a strong killing intent burst out from their bodies. "Kid, you're too arrogant. Humph. There are really some hotheads who are not afraid of death." As they spoke, the two of them took out their swords and magic weapons at the same time and rushed toward Ji Tianqing and Yunyao with murderous intent. "How dare you snatch my territory? You're courting death. Kid who doesn't know the immensity of heaven and earth. I'll let you know now that there's always someone better than you." As they shouted angrily, the two of them waved their swords and slashed out an overwhelming amount of sword and saber radiance that shrouded Ji Tianqing and Yunyao's figures. Ji Tianqing did not even use the sword of burial of heaven. He directly raised his palms and slapped out two dazzling golden lights toward the two of them. The golden lights formed into two giant palms and burst out a violent power that instantly destroyed the sword and saber radiance. Bang! Bang! In the muffled sound, the two middle-aged men were hit at the same time. They spat out mouthfuls of blood and flew backward, smashing hard on the golden light shield at the entrance of the cave. Thousands of pieces of golden light were wrapped by the violent force and splashed in all directions. The piles of rocks on the ground outside the cave were also shaken into powder and scattered in the air. The two groups of warriors near the entrance of the cave quickly released their magic power to form a shield to block the violent shock wave. After the dust and sand dispersed, the area within a radius of 10 miles outside the cave became flat and clean. The two martial sages in purple robes and golden armor staggered up from the ground with their faces full of blood. The two of them were angry and shocked. They stared fiercely at Ji Tianqing. Seeing Ji Tianqing approaching step by step, the two of them subconsciously stepped back. However, the golden light shield was behind them, and there was no way to retreat. "Kitty, don't be so arrogant." The purple-robed man held his treasured saber and pointed it at Ji Tianqing. He put on a brave front and shouted, "First come, first served. Only those who can break the ceiling formation can be considered capable. If you break the rules like this, you will become the enemy of all martial sages. You will definitely not have a good ending." The middle-aged man in golden armor also said indignantly, "Kid, even if you're strong, you'll definitely bring trouble to yourself if you provoke everyone's anger. If you leave now, we can pretend that nothing has happened. If you insist on making things difficult for us, then don't blame us for fighting you to the death." Although the two of them sounded tough on the surface, they were actually terrified in their hearts. Ji Tianqing did not take their threats to heart at all. With a contemptuous sneer, he said, "The fish will die, but the net will not break." As soon as he finished speaking, he raised his hands again. Dazzling starlight accumulated in his palms. Seeing that he was about to attack again, the two men's faces suddenly changed. They flew to the left side with fear, and fled in a panic. Of course, it was too shameful to flee with their tails between their legs. The two of them did not forget to say a few words. "Kid, if you insist on doing things your own way, you'll definitely cause big trouble. You're finished. You'll become the target of everyone. Let's wait and see." As soon as they finished speaking, the two of them had already fled 10 miles away. Ji Tianqing waved his hands and shot out two huge starlight swords toward the two men across the air. Bang bang! The starlight swords pierced the two of them fiercely, and two loud, dull sounds were heard. The middle-aged man in golden armor was pierced by the huge starlight swords, and his armor shattered. He fell into the canyon with blood spurting out from his body. The purple-robed man was also hit by the sword light. Blood spurted out from his body, and he let out a shrill scream. The two of them were terrified. They ignored their injuries and hurriedly got up to speed to escape. Ji Tianqing did not chase after them. He watched the two figures disappear into the depths of the canyon. Then he turned his head to look at the warriors on both sides. When his gaze swept over them, the warriors on both sides were on high alert. They instinctively drew their swords and sabers. Ji Tianqing said expressionlessly, "I don't want to repeat what I said just now. Get lost." The two groups of warriors were instantly enraged by the humiliation. Their faces were filled with grief and indignation. After hesitating for a while, the two martial sages in the lead suppressed their anger and retreated with their subordinates. After retreating for 20 miles, the two groups of people stopped and hid in the woods and among the rocks. They looked at Ji Tianqing and Yun Yao from afar. Of course, they were not willing to leave just like that. They were just hiding not far away and waiting for an opportunity. Once Ji Tianqing broke the formation and something unexpected happened, they would definitely take the opportunity to attack and hit him when he was down. When Ji Tianqing saw that the two groups of people were showing weakness, he ignored them and walked to the entrance of the cave. He used the secret technique of the divine eye, causing his eyes to turn dark gold. He stared at the golden light shield at the entrance of the cave without blinking. The scene he saw immediately changed. The dazzling golden light shield turned into a huge fishing net. It was made up of thousands of golden threads. Those were the veins and structure of the ceiling formation. Ji Tianqing focused on observing the formation. His brain was also working quickly to analyze the formation structure and deduce a way to break it. Yun Yao stood beside him. Her divine sense covered the surrounding 300 miles. She was secretly on guard. Once someone approached and tried to harm Ji Tianqing, they would definitely be stopped by her. Soon 15 minutes passed. Ji Tianqing finally saw through the ceiling formation and deduced a way to break it. He raised his palms and started to cast spells. He shot out rays of 5-colored brilliance and injected them into the golden light shield. Under his control, the 5-colored brilliance entered the golden light shield and quietly changed the veins of the formation. In just a few short minutes, the first ceiling array formation was broken by him. The dark gold defensive light shield melted quickly like snow under the sun. Ji Tianqing didn't stop there. His eyes glowed with golden light as he stared at the second ceiling formation. He stared at the dark red light shield with full concentration. He observed and analyzed the formation structure and deduced a way to break it. As time passed, the canyon became darker and darker. At the same time, a few more martial saints arrived at the canyon and landed near the entrance of the cave. There were a total of 6 martial saints. They were divided into 3 groups and stood dozens of miles away from the entrance of the cave. They secretly observed for a while before flying toward the entrance of the cave. However, they were quickly stopped by 2 groups of martial artists. The 2 groups of martial artists were very angry. They told the 6 martial saints that the entrance of the secret territory had been occupied by Ji Tianqing and Yun Yao. No one could even think of approaching them. Otherwise, they would infuriate Ji Tianqing and Yun Yao and bring about a fatal disaster. These 2 groups of martial artists had been humiliated by Ji Tianqing before. They were angry but did not dare to say anything. Therefore, they deliberately exaggerated and fanned the flames to provoke the 6 martial saints. The 6 martial saints were indeed enraged. They were full of anger and were full of hostility toward Ji Tianqing and Yun Yao. Isn't that kid too arrogant? Does he want to be everyone's enemy? The illusory sky secret territory is martial god Nangong's cave. The fated ones can get it. Every martial artist in the world has a chance. What right does he have to occupy the entrance? We are all martial saints who have been famous for many years. What kind of world have we not seen? How can we be intimidated by a kid and not move forward? Chapter 23:11. After 15 minutes, Ji Tianqing finally saw through the second array. He was about to use a secret technique to break through the dark red defensive light shield. At this moment, more than 10 martial artists flew over from both sides and landed on the empty ground outside the cave. 8 martial sages and 4 martial lords surrounded the cave entrance in a half-moon shape, surrounding Ji Tianqing and Yun Yao. Seeing that they had come with ill intentions, Yun Yao's face turned cold, and her eyes shone with a cold light. She took 2 steps forward with an indifferent expression, shielding Ji Tianqing behind her, and looked at the crowd with a sharp gaze. Swoosh! A silver light flashed in her hands and 2 silver-white swords appeared, exuding an extremely sharp sword aura. Yun Yao waved her right hand, and a blazing white sword radiance appeared, drawing a half-moon-shaped gully on the ground in front of the crowd. Whoever dares to cross this line will be killed without mercy. Yun Yao pointed at the crowd with her sword and shouted coldly with an expressionless face. Such an arrogant and domineering attitude immediately angered the crowd. In particular, the older martial sages were even more furious. They were so angry that they started laughing. Haha, little girl, you're too arrogant. You want to make everyone your enemy? You're overestimating yourselves. It's understandable that you're young and frivolous, but people as arrogant and ignorant as you are really pitiful. You want to intimidate us by drawing a line? Do you think we're 3-year-old children? These martial sages came later. They had different appearances, but they were all dressed luxuriously and had an extraordinary aura. After all, they were all tyrants who dominated a region. They were martial arts leaders who had been in high positions for a long time, or the rulers of an empire. Yunyao was too lazy to argue with them. She held 2 swords and looked at the crowd coldly, ready to launch a thunderous attack at any time. At this moment, an old man with white hair and a beard walked out of the crowd. He stroked his beard with his left hand and held a purple jade ruby in his right hand. He stepped over the line on the ground and walked toward Yunyao with an arrogant expression. I'm going to cross this line. Let's see what a little girl like you can do to me. The white-haired old man sneered. His expression was filled with contempt and mockery. Yunyao immediately frowned. She swung her sword as fast as lightning, sending out starry sword lights that filled the sky. Take responsibility for your own life and death. Following her cold shout, the more than 90 starry sword lights formed a sword formation with a radius of 3,000 meters and pressed down on the white-haired old man. Swish! Swish! In an instant, sword chi burst out within the gorge with dazzling brilliance, causing one to be unable to open their eyes or breathe. The white-haired old man didn't hesitate either. His left palm struck out with surging golden flames, while his right hand waved the purple jade scepter, sending out dozens of dark purple lightning arcs. The moment he struck, he displayed the strength of a 6th-degree martial saint and used the power of thunder. Pung pung pung. With a series of muffled sounds, the golden flames and lightning arcs that filled the sky were immediately crushed into pieces by the sword light. More than half of the sword light was shattered, but there were still more than 30 of them left. They enveloped the white-haired elder, leaving him nowhere to hide. Bang 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 bang. Another series of muffled sounds was heard. The white-haired old man was hit by more than 10 swords. Instantly blood spurted out and he let out a painful scream. The violent impact immediately exploded, sending the sand and stones all over the ground flying. The white-haired old man was sent flying 10 miles away and fell miserably into the gorge. By the time he got up from the ground, his face was already covered with blood, and there were more than 10 wounds on his body. Blood kept gushing out, dyeing his white robe red. His entire body was covered with mud, and he looked rather miserable. He no longer had the demeanor of a reclusive expert. The other 11 martial saints and martial monarchs were also shaken by the impact, their faces pale. Everyone retreated and tried their best to resist the impact. Only then did they dissipate the power of the impact. Yunyao didn't chase after them. She stood at the same spot and looked coldly at the crowd. She shouted in a deep voice, "This is only a warning. If anyone wants to die, I'll fulfill his wish." The crisp and cold voice reverberated in the gorge, shaking the hearts of the dozens of practitioners. The 4 martial monarchs quietly retreated, their eyes filled with deep fear. However, the martial saints were even more furious and ashamed. They all exploded with a strong fighting spirit. "Damn you, bitch. You've gone too far. I'll kill you." The white-haired old man flew back as fast as lightning. His face was as gloomy as ice. He crazily charged at Yunyao. He made a mysterious seal with his left hand and condensed a giant axe the size of a mountain with a dark golden light. It fell from the sky and chopped at Yunyao. He waved the purple jade ruby with his right hand and shot out 9 Zidian dragons toward Yunyao. The other 7 martial saints were also filled with righteous indignation. They roared in unison and brandished their swords and sabers toward Yunyao. "They're too arrogant. Everyone, let's join forces and kill them. This adulterous couple is the scum and disgrace of the martial world. Let's join forces and get rid of them for Tianqing. No matter how strong they are, they can't stop us. Everyone, let's attack together." Suddenly, everyone waved their swords and sabers, which covered the sky and the sun. They poured toward Yunyao like a torrential flood. No matter how strong Yunyao was, It was impossible for her to block the joint attack of 8 martial saints. She would definitely be careless and might even be injured. However, Ji Tianqing stopped casting and suddenly turned around. A fierce murderous intent flashed in his eyes. He held the sword of burial of heaven in his right hand. An unparalleled domineering aura burst out from his body. He attacked with all his might. Swoosh! Swoosh! He shot out a golden dragon claw as big as a mountain from his left palm. It smashed the giant axe that fell from the sky and sent 2 martial saints flying. He waved the sword of burial of heaven in his right hand and shot out 49 starry sword radiances, which destroyed the martial arts light that filled the sky. More than 20 sword radiances were shattered. The other 20 starry swords hit 4 martial saints hard and sent them flying. Yunyao also used her unique swordsmanship. The 2 martial saints were covered with wounds. Blood spurted out from their bodies. They screamed and flew away. In the blink of an eye, the 8 martial saints were sent flying more than 10 miles away. They fell into the valley and smashed into the rocks and ruins. Everyone was seriously injured. There were hideous wounds on their chests and backs. Dark red blood kept gushing out and staining their clothes. However, Ji Tianqing and Yunyao stood at the entrance of the cave unscathed. Their bodies were full of chilling murderous intent. The husband and wife joined forces and defeated the 8 martial saints easily. Such terrifying strength made the 8 martial saints and 4 martial monarchs show deep fear. They were angry and humiliated. Everyone got up from the ground and glared at Ji Tianqing and Yunyao. Damn bastards! You are so domineering. Sooner or later, you will be besieged and hacked to death by everyone. Young people, the Jianghu is very big and the waves are even bigger. You are so unscrupulous. Soon you will be overturned. I am waiting to see your end. There are at least a dozen martial saints rushing here. Let's see how long you can last. I keep feeling that these 2 people are familiar, especially that white-robed guy. He's so young but he's so strong. He's definitely not a nobody. Some people curse it angrily. Some people were waiting to watch a good show. Some people were guessing the identities of Ji Tianqing and Yunyao. Chapter 23:12. These martial sacred realm experts had been through hundreds of battles and had survived countless trials and tribulations. Being able to bend and endure humiliation were basic skills that they had honed over the years. They knew very well that martial artists who were brave for a moment would often die young. Only those who knew their limits and knew when to advance and retreat could live long and have the last laugh. After saying a few harsh words, the crowd dispersed and split into 5 groups to stay in the canyon. While treating their injuries, they stared at Ji Tianqing and Yunyao at the entrance of the cave. They believed that as long as they preserved their strength and waited patiently, they would find a chance to take revenge. Seeing that everyone had left, Ji Tianqing did not waste any more time. He turned around and continued to break the array. Yunyao held the silver moon twin swords and stood beside Ji Tianqing. She was on guard with a cold expression. The arc she drew on the ground was like an invisible wall that blocked all the martial artists. No one dared to get close. 15 minutes later, Ji Tianqing cast hundreds of seals and finally broke the second seal array. The dark red flame barrier immediately collapsed and disintegrated. On the surface, the entrance of the cave looked empty. There seemed to be no obstacles. However, Ji Tianqing waved his hand and shot out a silver light, activating the third defensive array. Swoosh! A 5-colored barrier appeared out of thin air at the entrance of the cave, enveloping half of the mountain wall. He then cast the God's Eye secret technique and carefully observed the sacred array, thinking of a way to break it. The canyon was silent. The sun in the sky was about to set. The canyon was dark and the temperature was dropping rapidly. Waves of coldness kept coming. After about an hour, Ji Tianqing finally deduced the correct way to break the array and started to cast the secret technique. At this moment, a few figures flew over from the clouds above the canyon. Swoosh! Swoosh! After the 5-colored brilliance faded, 5 figures with different figures appeared. They were 5 martial sages. The leader was a white-haired hunchback elder with a walking stick in his hand. It was Lord Tong. The other 4 martial saints were relatively young. There were 3 men and 1 woman. The man in the white robe and carrying a large sword case was the young master of the Jiang family, Jiang Qi. The slightly plump, middle-aged man in the green robe was Helian Wujua. The other two were Beauty and the Beast. Tuobada was wearing an animal skin jacket and a pair of flood dragon skin shorts. Tantai Xian was wearing a golden dress, looking both enchanting and dignified. The five of them stood in the white clouds and looked down at the cave at the bottom of the valley. Soon they saw the situation clearly. That's strange. There are clearly several groups of people present. Why aren't they fighting? Jiang Qi frowned in confusion. Helian Wujua also found it strange. He said in a playful tone, "Those people are all martial saints. They are actually hiding in the dark and observing? Are the people of the Xinwu continent so modest?" Tuobada stroked the full beard on his face and said with a cold smile, "Didn't you see that those few groups of martial artists were all injured? It seemed like they had already fought and lost. As for the winner, it would definitely be the young man and woman. Otherwise, why would they dare to block the entrance of the secret realm to study the formation?" Jiang Qi and Helian Wujua's gazes immediately gathered on Ji Tianqing and Yun Yao. Ji Tianqing's back was facing the group, and he was fully focused on breaking the formation. Only Yun Yao was holding two swords and facing the group with a cold and vigilant posture. When they saw Yun Yao's appearance, Jiang Qi and Helian Wujua were stunned. Their eyes could not help but widen. After a while, the two of them came back to their senses. Their eyes shone brightly, and their faces were full of amazement. "Wow, that girl. No, that woman in the white dress, she is so beautiful. How can there be such a beautiful woman in this world? Her beauty is enough to topple a city, and her temperament is cold and otherworldly. She is like a goddess who has descended from the 9 heavens." Jiang Qi held his chest with both hands and looked at Yun Yao with an infatuated expression. He said with certainty, "Helian Wujua, I feel like my heart has been captured by her. I can't breathe. No matter what, I have to have her. You are not allowed to snatch her from me, or else I will fall out with you." Helian Wujua was furious. He scolded without turning his head, "F***CKU. I feel like my soul has been taken away by her. Let's compete fairly, Tuobada has no part in it." Tantai Xian did not speak. She looked deeply at the entrance of the cave, at the handsome figure in the white robe. "Nemesis, I didn't expect us to meet again." She looked at the back of the figure with a complicated expression. She muttered to herself, "Back then, I was disheartened and left Xinwu continent. I wanted to go to the North Sea to live in seclusion, even if it meant spending the rest of my life in Fengling Mountain. I didn't expect the world to be so fickle. The people from the 3 aristocratic families were ordered to kill you. After going around in circles, I still ended up here. Is this the will of the heavens? Are you and I bound to be entangled forever?" Just as Tantai Xian was in a daze, the hunchbacked old man, Master Tong, sneered. He used his walking stick to point at Ji Tianqing and Yun Yao at the entrance of the cave. He said in a playful tone, "We came at the right time. That handsome and beautiful young man and woman are the ones we are looking for." Hearing this, Jiang Qi, Helian Wujua, and Tuobada were shocked. Their expressions became a little strange. Jiang Qi quickly took out a scroll from his spatial ring. He opened it and glanced at it. Then he looked at Ji Tianqing at the entrance of the cave. This scroll was a portrait given by Yi Lushui. In the portrait was a handsome young man in a white robe. He had sharp eyebrows and bright eyes. He was holding a mysterious black sword. Jiang Qi compared a few times and kept the scroll. He nodded with a cold smile. "That's right, it's him. That beauty in the white robe should be his wife, Yun Yao." Helian Wujua pinched the thumb ring on his left hand and sneered. "Then what are we waiting for? Let's kill that kid and take his wife." Tuobada opened his wide mouth. He twisted his neck and moved his shoulders with a sinister smile. He took out 2 large millstone axes and rubbed his palms together in an eager manner. "Let's have a fair competition. Whoever kills Ji Tianqing will have his wife." Jiang Qi and Helian Wujua turned around and glared at him. They shouted, "Tuobada, you already have Xian. You have no part in this. Tuobada, get out of my way. You are eating from the bowl and still looking at the pot?" Master Tong turned around and looked at them. He said sternly, "Yi Lushui warned us that the kid is very powerful. Don't let your guard down." Jiang Qi, "Tuobada, and the other two all had disapproving expressions. The whole continent is spreading the legend of Ji Tianxing. It's too exaggerated, who would believe it? The so-called rumors are all hearsay. Who knows how many times they have been exaggerated? How can you take it seriously? But I heard that his wife is as beautiful as a goddess. That's true. I don't believe that a kid in his 20s can be so powerful. As they spoke, the three of them flew down to the entrance of the cave. Chapter 23:13. Jiangqi, Helian Wuzhua, and Tuobada swaggered outside the cave. Even though their target was Ji Tianxing. However, they ignored Ji Tianxing and stared at Yuniao. Their eyes were filled with amazement and infatuation. After all, they spent most of their time at Mt Fengling, and had not been to Xinwu continent for countless years. The only people they saw were from the three aristocratic families and their vassal forces. They were already sick of seeing them. Now that they saw a beauty like Yuniao, they recalled the young and beautiful women on Mt Fengling, and suddenly felt that they had been blind. Yuniao was the bright moon in the sky and the bright stars in the sky. On the other hand, the women on Mt Fengling had become vulgar and rural women. They were simply unbearable to look at. The arrival of Jiangqi and the other two naturally attracted everyone's attention. The warriors scattered in the canyon immediately became interested and looked at Jiangqi and the other two expectantly. Everyone secretly prayed that Jiangqi and the other two could defeat Ji Tianxing and Yuniao and teach them a painful lesson. Yuniao also gripped her silver moon swords tightly. Her aura became sharper and she shouted coldly, "If you don't want to die, stay outside the boundary obediently." Tuobada glanced at the gully below his feet and sneered. "Oh, this girl is quite domineering. However, I like ice beauties like you." Jiangqi glanced at him and scolded, "Like my ass. She's the fairy I've set my eyes on. I'll fall out with anyone who tries to snatch her away." Helian Wuzhua took out a bronze cauldron and scolded with a black face, "You two idiots, why are you talking about such useless things? Let's complete the mission and get rid of that kid first." Jiangqi had indeed restrained himself. He secretly accumulated magic power in his body, and locked onto Ji Tianxing's aura with his spirit. Tuobada still had an arrogant attitude and sneered at Yuniao, "Little beauty, we're here to find Ji Tianxing. This has nothing to do with you. Step aside obediently. After we kill Ji Tianxing, we'll have a good time with you." Before he could finish his words, Yuniao's expression changed, and a cold killing intent flashed in her eyes. She instantly understood that these three people were not here for the illusory void mystic realm, but to assassinate Ji Tianxing. Thus, she unhesitatingly brandished her silver moon twin swords, and used all of her power to pierce out a sky full of cold stars. Swish! Swish! Over 100 starry sword lights formed a marvelous sword formation, and pressed down on Tuobada and the other two. Suddenly, the dazzling starlight illuminated the sky, so dazzling that people couldn't open their eyes. Tuobada hurriedly waved his huge axe and slashed out two huge white tiger phantoms towards Yuniao. Helian Wuzhua cast a spell with both hands and controlled the bronze cauldron to release a raging fire that descended from the sky and enveloped Yuniao. Jiangqi also performed a sword technique with both hands, and the sword case on his back opened automatically. Two treasured swords, one green and one purple, flew out and attacked Yuniao. Bam 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 bam. The sky was full of sword lights and saber shadows clashed, exploding a deafening sound that reverberated in the canyon. Thousands of light shards were enveloped by the terrifying shockwave and scattered in all directions, covering a radius of tens of miles. Those practitioners who were nearby all retreated far away, afraid that they would be affected by the shockwave. After a moment, when the colorful shockwave dissipated, the sky full of sand and dust settled down, and the scene regained its clarity. Jiangqi, Helian Wuzhua and Tuobada spread out in a semicircle, surrounding the entrance of the cave. The three of them were unscathed, and their bodies were filled with fighting spirit, accumulating destructive power. Yuniao was still standing at the entrance of the cave. She wasn't injured, but her face was pale and she was pushed back a few steps. She frowned as she looked at Jiangqi and the other two, thinking to herself, "These three young martial saints have reached the 7th degree realm, and they have cultivated ancient secret skills. They are hard to deal with." At this moment Jiangqi transmitted his voice to Helian Wuzhua and Tuobada. Tuobada, you hold back Yunyao, Helian and I will deal with Ji Tianqing. Let's end this quickly. Tuobada didn't think much and agreed without hesitation. Don't worry. I promise to hold back the little beauty and not let her run away. Jiangqi and Helian Wuzhua looked at each other and sneered in their hearts. Tuobada is an idiot. After we kill Ji Tianqing, not only can we complete the mission and get the reward, we can also decide who Yunyao belongs to. But Tuobada doesn't understand. In the next moment, the three of them attacked again, unleashing their full power and displaying their marvelous secret skills. Dragon Elephant Heaven Suppressing Seal. Tuobada roared and waved his pair of millstone axes, slashing out a dark golden divine dragon and a golden divine elephant as big as a mountain towards Yunyao. Jiangqi controlled the purple and green dual swords, unleashing thousands of chilling rays that enveloped Ji Tianqing's body. Helian Wuzhua also cast a spell, controlling the medicine cauldron to release a sky-burning fire that poured down like a flood. An aura that could destroy the heavens and extinguish the earth, as well as a violent and shocking power, immediately exploded outside the cave. The surrounding 100 miles were sealed by an invisible force. Even the air was compressed and disappeared. This area became a vacuum zone and was extremely dangerous. At this critical moment, Yunyao swung her dual swords with all her might, unleashing hundreds of starry giant swords that shot towards Tuobada like shooting stars. Boom! 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 The starry giant swords clashed with the dragon elephant shadow, creating an earth-shattering sound and exploding into billions of light shards. The incomparably violent impact caused the canyon to shake incessantly. The ground cracked open, and the mountain walls collapsed into countless pieces of rubble. Ji Tianqing also stopped breaking the array, and turned around to face Jiangqi and Helian Wuzhua. Heaven-splitting sword. He held the sword of burial of heaven with both hands and slashed out a 1,000-feet-long golden sword. Bang! 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 Jiangqi's boundless sword light and Helian Wuzhua's monstrous fire were both shattered into pieces by the giant sword and scattered everywhere. Ji Tianqing ignored the flames and spell shadows in the sky. He flew across the sky expressionlessly and arrived in front of Jiangqi as fast as lightning. God-slaying sword. He roared and slashed down with the sword of burial of heaven. Jiangqi's expression changed. He used all his strength to control the purple and green dual swords to block the attack. Gotcha! However, with a thunderous sound, he was sent flying by the giant sword and crashed into the ruins 30 miles away. The purple and green dual swords were also exhausted and fell from the sky. Ji Tianqing teleported again and appeared behind Helian Wuzhua. He punched with his left hand. Star-shattering fist. The huge golden fist radiance sent the bronze cauldron flying and hit Helian Wuzhua's back. His body bent like a shrimp and blood spurted out from his nose and mouth. He drew an arc in the sky and fell into the ruins 20 miles away. On the other side, Yunyao was still defending against Tuobada's fierce attacks. Ji Tianqing dashed over again like a ghost and slashed out a 5-colored lightning with his sword, sending Tuobada flying. He crashed into the ruins with his body charred and smoking. In the blink of an eye, the 3 powerful young martial sages were beaten up by Ji Tianqing. They lay on the ground pathetically. Chapter 23:14. Are you even worthy? These short words were like sharp blades that pierced fiercely into the hearts of Jiangqi, Tuobada, and the others. An unparalleled sense of humiliation surged from their hearts and filled their entire bodies. The 3 climbed out of the ruins and flew into the sky, surrounding Ji Tianqing in the middle. Tuobada wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth and grinned. Ji Tianqing, it seems that the rumors are true. You do have some skills. I, Tuobada, don't kill nameless people. This is perfect. You have the right to die under my myriad beasts' war axe. Helian Wuzhua held the bronze cauldron in his right hand and said gloomily, It's just a difference of 1 move. It's no big deal. We underestimated you just now, but you won't be so lucky next time. Jiangqi tidied up his messy hair and collar. He held the purple-green twin swords with both hands and stared at Ji Tianqing with a sharp gaze. Rumor has it that your swordsmanship is unparalleled. Unfortunately, I was born into a swordsmanship family, and have mastered a sword technique that has been passed down for tens of thousands of years. Today, I'll show you what it means to be the ancestor of swordsmanship. Although the three of them had been injured by Ji Tianxing and were in a sorry state, they were not discouraged. Instead, their fighting spirit was even higher. At this time, Yun Yao flew to Ji Tianxing's side and stood side by side with him. She stared coldly at Jiang Qi and the other two. She secretly transmitted her voice to Ji Tianxing. Based on their tone and their attire, they shouldn't be from the Xinwu continent. They should be from a hidden family overseas. They don't seem to be here for the illusory void secret realm. Their goal is to assassinate you. Ji Tianxing nodded and sneered. I can see that too. I just don't know who ordered them to do this, or if they have a grudge against me in the past. He had already begun to suspect that the illusory void secret realm was a conspiracy. Perhaps someone was using this information to lure him to the ruins of God and kill him here. Of course, he could not rule out the possibility that it was a power or family that he had offended in the past that was seeking revenge. At this moment, two figures flew out from the clouds and landed beside Jiang Qi. The newcomers were a hunchbacked old man and an enchanting woman. They were Master Tong and Tan Tai Xian. Ji Tianxing and Yun Yao's gazes immediately fell on the two of them. When he saw Tan Tai Xian, Ji Tianxing frowned fiercely, and a wisp of surprise flashed through his eyes. He had never thought that Tan Tai Xian would appear here and mix with this group of people. When he looked at Tan Tai Xian was also staring at him. Her face was expressionless and her eyes were as cold as ice. Ji Tianxing's lips curled into a sneer as he said in a mocking tone, Tan Tai Xian, I thought you would turn over a new leaf after that incident. I didn't expect you to find a new backer. Tan Tai Xian's body trembled slightly as a wisp of sorrow flashed through her heart. However, her expression did not change as she said in an indifferent tone, What does my choice have to do with you? Ji Tianxing nodded slightly and sneered, Very good. You should be clear about the consequences of being my enemy. Tan Tai Xian pursed her lips tightly and did not answer. Tuobata hurriedly flew to Tan Tai Xian's side, held her wrist nervously and asked, Xian, do you know Ji Tianxing? Tan Tai Xian said expressionlessly, Ji Tianxing is famous all over the world. Who doesn't know him? Such an ambiguous answer made Tuobata frown fiercely and feel a little confused. On the other side, Yun Yao just took a deep look at Tan Tai Xian and then withdrew her gaze. She did not ask Ji Tianxing, because she was the one who knew Ji Tianxing the best. She could guess without asking that Ji Tianxing and Tan Tai Xian must know each other. However, it was impossible for there to be any feelings or ambiguity between them. Even if Ji Tianxing was blind, it was impossible. At this time, the hunchbacked old man, Master Tong, walked towards Ji Tianxing and said in a low voice, Everyone says that Ji Tianxing is the reincarnation of Kenshin, and can be called the #1 genius in the world. However, I have never believed in rumors. Today, I want to try and see if I can crush a legend with my own hands. As he spoke, Master Tong's entire body burst forth with soaring battle intent, emitting an incomparably domineering aura. At this moment, he was no longer a hunchbacked old man. He was like a lofty mountain that people could only look up to. Sky-opening palm. Master Tong suddenly shouted coldly and raised his left hand with an imposing aura. He struck out a 5-colored torrent and blasted it towards Ji Tianxing. The 5-colored torrent condensed into a giant palm as big as a mountain. It was like a giant axe that could split heaven and earth. It struck down with terrifying power. At that moment, the heaven and earth within a radius of 300 miles were sealed and solidified like ice. The 5-colored giant axe seemed to have absorbed the power of heaven and earth within 1,000 miles, and was determined to crush Ji Tianxing into pieces. Such a terrifying attack had already reached the peak of the martial sage realm. It was just short of a transformation of power, and it was the means of a martial god. Ji Tianxing instantly understood that the hunchbacked old man was a 9th-degree martial sage realm peak. A half-step to martial god. Celestial dragon overlord body. His body surged with golden light and expanded vigorously. He instantly became a 10 feet tall golden armored giant. It was as if the god of war had descended to the world. His combat power had also increased by 5 times and he had reached the peak of the martial sage realm. He was no weaker than Master Tong. Sky-breaking finger. Ji Tianqing shouted and raised his left hand. His index and middle fingers were like a sword and pierced towards the sky. A huge golden finger shadow appeared, and it was like a giant sword that could support the heavens and earth. It pierced towards the five-colored giant palm fiercely. In the next moment, the two collided fiercely and an earth-shattering sound exploded. Kaboom! Amidst the thunderous sound, the golden finger shadow and the five-colored giant palm collapsed at the same time and shattered into light fragments that covered the sky and earth. A violent burst of energy swept out in all directions. Ji Tianqing and Master Tong did not move at all, and were not affected by the shockwave at all. Jiang Qi and Tuobada's expressions changed as they hurriedly released their protective dermic powers to protect themselves. Rumble! The shockwave wreaked havoc in the canyon and affected a few hundred miles. It shook the ground and the mountains, giving off a loud dull sound. The few groups of martial practitioners who were closer to the battle were all shaken to the point of staggering, their faces pale. The martial sages could still dissolve the power of the shockwave, but the few martial monarchs were unlucky. They were all sent flying and bleeding from their 7 orifices. After the shockwave dissipated, the crowd regained their composure. They were extremely shocked and terrified. Oh my God! That old man looks ordinary, but he is so powerful? A half-step to martial god realm master? There are less than 3 in the entire continent. Who is that old man? Ji Tianqing is so powerful? I thought the hunchbacked old man could defeat him, but I didn't expect them to be tied. Chapter 23:15. While everyone was still in a daze, Ji Tianqing and Master Tong fought again. Ji Tianqing waved the Heaven Barrier sword and slashed out a huge starry sword that covered the sky and earth. It crisscrossed and attacked Lord Tong. Master Tong swung his walking stick horizontally and unleashed 3 blue light waves that were 1,000 feet tall. They swept out like huge waves. Bang bang bang. The starry sword clashed with the blue light waves and created 3 earth-shattering sounds. The berserk energy exploded, shaking the tall mountains on both sides of the canyon. Cracks appeared on them and countless rocks collapsed. Ji Tianqing didn't move at all, but Master Tong was pushed back 10 steps. His wrinkled face flushed red. Before he could suppress the Dharma power in his body, Ji Tianqing pressed forward and slashed down with the Sword of Burial of Heaven. Heavenly Dragon Slash. Ji Tianqing roared furiously as he swung his sword and slashed out a huge sword that was 3,000 meters long. Master Tong was trying to suppress the Dharma power in his body. Seeing the giant golden sword slashing towards him, he quickly waved his walking stick to block it. Jiang Qi, Tuobada and Helian Wuzhua didn't stay idle either. They quickly used their secret techniques to help Master Tong fight against Ji Tianqing. The 3 of them were arrogant and didn't like each other. They were always bickering and didn't like each other. But at this critical moment, the 3 of them abandoned all other thoughts and attacked Ji Tianqing with all their might. Yunyao also brandished her silver moon dual swords. Cold stars filled the sky as she blocked the attacks of the 3 young martial saints. The 2 sides fought fiercely in the canyon and used their secret techniques. Light flashed everywhere and loud sounds shook the sky. Boom! Bang 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 bang. Suddenly the canyon was in chaos and the sky was filled with colorful lights. The violent and raging energy fiercely impacted the canyon and the mountain ranges on both sides, sending countless rocks and dirt flying, splashing up dust that covered the sky and covered the sun. The 6 groups of martial artists nearby quickly retreated away from the center of the battlefield to avoid being injured by the aftershocks. The battle between the martial sacred realm experts lasted for 15 minutes. After exchanging a few hundred blows, the outcome of the battle was gradually decided. Ji Tianqing and Yunyao's hair was messy, and their white clothes were stained with blood. Their faces were pale, and their magic power was greatly exhausted. However, the situation of Master Tong, Jiang Qi, and the other 3 was even more miserable. Master Tong's hair was disheveled, and his gray linen clothes had been torn into rags. There were several hideous wounds on his chest and back. Jiang Qi's sword box dimmed and the azulate swords trembled as their light flickered. He was covered in blood. His face was covered in blood, and there was a bowl-sized hole in his chest. One could vaguely see his dark red heart. One of Tuobada's legs had been cut off, and there was a foot-long wound on his waist that almost cut him in half. Helian Wuzhua was also covered in sword wounds, a total of 18 wounds so deep that his bones could be seen. There was a hideous wound on the right side of his face, and blood kept gushing out. Half of his face was about to fall off. However, he was proficient in artifact refining and alchemy, so he had already taken some healing pills to suppress his injuries. The two sides were still fighting. Suddenly, Ji Tianqing seized the opportunity to find Master Tong's weakness and used his trump card without hesitation. God-killing spear. He raised his left hand, and golden flame surged out of his palm, forming a golden spear that was more than 10 feet long. He thrust it toward Master Tong. Swish! The spear turned into a golden light and shot across the sky, arriving in front of Master Tong. Master Tong's expression changed drastically. His eyes widened in shock, and his eyes were filled with fear. He wanted to teleport away, but it was too late. He tried to block the attack with his black walking stick, but it was useless. Boom! Amidst a thunderous boom, the god-slaying spear pierced through his chest. His thin and weak body suddenly exploded, turning into thousands of pieces that flew in all directions. A faint golden god soul flew into the distance amidst the pieces of flesh and blood that filled the sky. Ji Tianqing had destroyed the body of Master Tong, who was at the half-step to martial god realm. Such a terrifying scene immediately filled all the spectating cultivators with fear, cold sweat dripping down their backs. Jiang Qi, Tuobada, and Helian Wuzhua were terrified. Their eyes were wide open, and the battle intent in their hearts dissipated. They knew that they were no match for Ji Tianqing. With Master Tong and expert present, they had their backbone and they had dared to think about how to kill Ji Tianqing. However, Master Tong had been defeated and his body had been destroyed by Ji Tianqing. Their confidence was destroyed, and they turned around to escape without hesitation. Swish! 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 The three of them flew as fast as they could. They followed Master Tong's divine soul and flew toward the end of the valley. They were different from ordinary martial sages, and they did not want to say anything to regain their dignity, because they knew very well that they would only be asking for humiliation, and it was meaningless. Since they had been defeated, it was more important to escape. Tantai Xian who had been watching the battle in the sky, stared at Ji Tianqing in disbelief. She was the most shocked and in disbelief. She knew that Ji Tianqing was not as powerful as he was now at the northern battlefield of the Luoshui Holy Kingdom. In comparison, Ji Tianqing was 20 times more powerful than he had been at that time. She could not imagine what Ji Tianqing had gone through. How could his strength have increased 20 times in a year? However, she quickly came to her senses. She took a deep look at Ji Tianqing, and then she turned around to escape in a hurry. She followed Jiang Qi, Tuobada, and the others and flew toward the north. After a few breaths, Tantai Xian Jiang Qi, and the others disappeared into the horizon. The deep and dark valley gradually became peaceful again. Ji Tianqing and Yunyao stood outside the cave. They put away their swords and took a few elixirs. Within 100 miles, the several groups of dumbfounded martial artists gradually came to their senses. Everyone broke out in a cold sweat, and their hearts were filled with fear and awe. After witnessing Master Tong's body being destroyed, they finally realized that Ji Tianqing's strength was infinitely close to the divine realm. It was extremely terrifying. They did not dare to have any more fantasies. They all quietly retreated dozens of miles, for fear that Ji Tianqing would vent his anger on them. At this moment, Yunyao turned her head to look at Ji Tianqing beside her and asked, "We fought just now. Those three young martial saints are all descendants of ancient aristocratic families. One is proficient in the sword principle, one is proficient in refining Dharma treasures, and the last one has combined the soul of 10,000 beasts with martial arts. Can you tell if they're assassins under someone's orders or if they're your enemies from back then?" Ji Tianqing frowned and thought for a moment. Then he nodded and said, "If I am not wrong, they should be the disciples of the three big hidden sects. They are the three big families that have existed for tens of thousands of years. They used to live in seclusion in the Star Moon Cave and were quite mysterious." Chapter 23:16. I see. Yunyao nodded and asked, "It seems like this is a conspiracy and it has something to do with martial god Tianju. However, I don't understand. The three aristocratic families and martial god Tianju are enemies. Why would they want to assassinate you? As the old saying goes, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Shouldn't they join hands with you to deal with martial god Tianju? Ji Tianqing shook his head and smiled. That makes sense, but it's not absolute. If martial god Tianju has some deal with the three aristocratic families and both sides have reached some kind of cooperation, then it's not surprising that they want to assassinate me. Yun Yao understood his meaning and didn't ask anymore. Ji Tianqing glanced at her and teased with a smile. That's all you have to ask? You don't have anything else to ask? What else? Yun Yao asked in confusion. Ji Tianqing said with a playful smile, under normal circumstances, you should ask me who that woman is and how we know each other. What's our relationship? Yun Yao rolled her eyes at him and pretended to be angry. Do you think I'm that kind of secular woman who is jealous of a man? I know and trust your character and conduct the best. Although that woman is beautiful, she's too seductive and flirtatious. Judging from her demeanor and temperament, she was most likely a woman who had many subordinates under her skirt. You don't even have the interest to look at such an impure woman. How could you have anything to do with her? Ji Tianqing looked at her gently and held her hands. He said with a sincere tone, as expected, the person who understands me the best is you. There are many things that I don't need to say and you can understand. Yun Yao nodded and said with emotion, Aku and you have 2 lives of love. She has never regretted it and even died for you once. However, you married me. You didn't want me to be sad, so you kept rejecting her and would rather hurt her. If I didn't play the matchmaker and resolve the knot in your heart, I don't know how much you would hurt her. Even a woman like Aku who is loyal to you, you kept rejecting her. How could those common women of the pugilistic world enter your eyes? I'm even sure that other than me and Aku, you'll never fall in love with a third woman in your life. Ji Tianqing thought about it seriously and nodded in agreement. Yes, you're right. Yun Yao rolled her eyes at him and said with a smile, all right, let's hurry up and break the formation. The commotion caused by the battle just now was too great. It would definitely attract many martial sages over. I'm afraid this place will soon become lively, and when that happens there will be more dangers. Ji Tianqing nodded and didn't say anything else, continuing to crack the array formation. Yun Yao held the silver moon twin swords and stood by his side to protect him. She vigilantly monitored the surroundings. Unknowingly, an hour had passed. Ji Tianqing broke the 3rd multicolored light barrier and activated the 4th seal. Meanwhile, deep in the mountains 30,000 kilometers away from the Grand Canyon, in the belly of a 3,000-meter tall mountain, Jiangqi, Tuobada, and Tantai were hiding in a dark and gloomy cave. Other than Tantai, the 3 of them were covered in blood. They were badly injured and their combat abilities were severely reduced. The most miserable one was Master Tong, whose physical body had been destroyed. He was only left with a ball of divine soul, which floated in the dark cave, flashing and dimming. Jiangqi's face was full of hatred. He clenched his fist and hit the rock in front of him. He cursed in a hoarse voice, damn bastard. He's so young. How could he have such terrifying strength? Helian Wuzhua healed his injuries and nodded. Even if he started cultivating when he was in his mother's womb, he has only cultivated for 20 years. How could he reach the half-step to divine realm? In the past 10,000 years, there is definitely no one else like him who reached the peak of the martial sage realm in 20 years. He's not human. He's definitely a god. Master Tong's voice came out from the flickering divine soul. He's the reincarnation of a god. How can we judge him with common sense? We underestimated him and didn't believe the legends on the continent. Now, it seems that he's even more powerful than the legends. Master Tong's voice was low and hoarse, full of fatigue and regret. He was already very old and had no hope of reaching the martial god realm. Now, his physical body was destroyed. Even if he spent 100 years to rebuild his physical body, it would not be as good as before. Tuobada did not interrupt. He frowned and pondered. After a while, he turned to look at Tantai and asked in a low voice, you knew Ji Tianqing long ago and knew how powerful he was. Why didn't you tell us earlier? Tantai sneered and said calmly, you must have forgotten that I've reminded you 4 times that Ji Tianqing is not an ordinary martial sage. You must be careful. However, you were too arrogant and completely ignored my words. Now that you've lost, you're blaming me? Seeing that she was angry, Tuobada quickly explained, Xian'er, don't misunderstand. I'm not blaming you. I just think you should have told us earlier that you knew him. Sigh. He wanted to explain but found that he could not. No matter what, he was blaming Tantai Xian'er. Tantai Xian'er did not hide her disdain. She sneered and said, what you need to do now is not to feel sorry and regret. If you can't kill Ji Tianxing, you can't take back Xingyue Wonderland. You're all seriously injured and can't recover in a short time. The only way now is to contact Yi Lushui and act with them. That's the only way. Jiang Qi frowned and said reluctantly, we're in such a mess now. Why should we go to Yi Lushui? Let him see us as a joke and mock us wantonly? Helian Wuzhua also shook his head and said, let's heal for a few days first. We'll talk about it after we've recovered. Only Master Tong said earnestly, Miss Xian'er is right. What we need to do now is to meet Yi Lushui. Ji Tianxing is very powerful and has extraordinary means. I'm afraid he'll break the seal of the secret land soon. If we heal for a few days, he'll have entered the secret land by then. Jiang Qi and Tuobada still wanted to refute, but Master Tong ordered in a dignified tone, you don't have to say more. Follow my orders. Tonight you'll heal your wounds and try to cover them. Tomorrow morning you'll meet Yi Lushui and follow his orders. Of course, when I'm not with you, you'd better be smart and be careful. Hearing this, Jiang Qi and Tuobada frowned and asked at the same time, Master Tong, you're not going with us. Chapter 23:17. For hours passed. It was midnight. Heaven and earth were as dark as ink, and the canyon was dead silent. Ji Tianxing finally cracked the fifth seal. As the blue defensive light shield dissipated, the seal at the entrance of the cave was completely removed. Ji Tianxing stopped and exhaled a long breath of turbid air. He had taken the first step to success and was very close to the illusory void secret realm. Let's go in. He led Yunyao into the cave and walked along the dark tunnel. The cave was slanted downwards and extended deep into the ground. About 10,000 feet deep, there was a huge five-colored light screen that sealed the entire cave. Ji Tianxing and Yunyao could both sense that the colorful light screen was emitting a powerful divine power. Without a doubt, that was the real seal of the illusory void secret realm. It was a genuine god-level array. The two of them crossed the 10,000 feet long tunnel and came under the five-colored light screen. Ji Tianxing stared at the five-colored light screen and used the God's Eye mystic technique to observe it carefully. Yunyao took out a light red elixir from her spatial ring and handed it to Ji Tianxing. Tianxing, you've been deciphering the array formation all this time, and you've even fought a few battles. Not only did you use up a lot of magic power, but your soul is also very tired. Take this elixir first to recover your soul and magic power. Then you can study the seal of the secret realm. Ji Tianxing thought for a moment, then took the pill and swallowed it. This was because his divine sense had detected that there were a few more groups of martial artists in the canyon. In the past 4 hours, another 5 groups of martial artists had arrived and were hiding around the entrance of the cave. He had to maintain an abundant amount of magic power and a clear and powerful soul to be able to guard against any possible danger. After taking the elixir, he sat cross-legged on a rock and regulated his breathing for 2 hours. The elixir's effect was immediate. It restored his magic power to its peak, and his mental state was more energetic. He then stood up and looked at the five-colored light screen, carefully observing and studying it. At the same time, more than a dozen groups of warriors in the canyon were whispering to each other. The next few waves of experts were basically martial sages from the 3 divine kingdoms. They considered themselves to be of high status and powerful, so they wanted to fly to the cave entrance. However, they had only flown a short distance when they were stopped by other martial saints. Brother, please don't be impulsive. The entrance to the secret realm has already been occupied. Who is so reckless as to occupy the entrance to the secret realm? It's Ji Tianxing. Oh, so it's him. Damn it, why is he here? With his status and means, I don't think martial god Nangong's cave abode is good enough for him. You don't know this, but there were a few groups of martial saints who clashed with Ji Tianxing. All of them were severely injured by him, and fled in a sorry state. Among them was a half-step martial god with a hunchback whose body had been destroyed by Ji Tianxing. Moreover, Ji Tianxing is arrogant, despotic, and ruthless. If you go up against him now, you're just looking for death. Thank you for your reminder, brother. If other martial saints had occupied the entrance, we would still stand a chance. Since Ji Tianxing is here, we can only retreat. Don't provoke that murderous god. Don't brother, don't be discouraged. Even if we can't defeat Ji Tianxing, we won't fight him head-on. We can wait here. Maybe there's still a chance? You're right. Let's wait and see. Similar conversations continued to take place in the canyon. When the new martial saints heard that Ji Tianxing had occupied the entrance to the secret realm, they did not dare to say anything. Some even wanted to retreat. However, after being persuaded and instigated by others, they all decided to stay. No one was willing to give up on martial god Nangong's cave abode. They were still hoping that a miracle would happen. Unknowingly, a night had passed. In the canyon outside the cave, a total of 18 groups of martial artists had gathered. There were more than 20 martial saints and more than 10 martial lords. Inside the cave, Ji Tianxing was still standing under the colorful light screen. He stared at the light screen, observing and deducing the formation. He was so immersed in it that he almost forgot about the passage of time. In the morning, the sun rose from the east. White mist lingered between the mountains. Under the golden sunlight, it shone like a fairyland. Jiangqi, Tuobada, and Tantai Xianer came out of the cave and flew up into the sky. After a night of rest and treatment, their injuries had stabilized. They still had 70% of their strength. Especially their external injuries, they were much better after treatment. The three of them tidied up their clothes and hair. They looked more normal than last night. Master Tong had left last night. In order to avoid unnecessary trouble, Master Tong returned to the North Sea in a low-key manner. Only Jiangqi, Tuobada, and the other two stayed to carry out the mission. After yesterday's setback, they were not confident. They had lost their drive and fighting spirit. Where are we going to find Yi Lushui? Helian Wuzhua looked at the rising sun with a gloomy face. What's there to find? Tuobada muttered in annoyance. Just send him a message and arrange a place to meet him. Jiangqi nodded in agreement. He took out a jade slip and sent a message to Yi Lushui. After waiting patiently for 15 minutes, they received Yi Lushui's reply. A beam of light flew from the sky and landed in front of Jiangqi. He quickly picked up the jade slip and read the message with his divine sense. After reading it, his expression changed slightly. He frowned unhappily. Helian Wuzhua and Tuobada looked at him and asked, Jiangqi, what did Yi Lushui say? Where did he say we should meet? Is there a problem? Jiangqi put away the jade slip and said expressionlessly, Yi Lushui said he has more important things to do and won't meet us. But he asked us to wait near the entrance and work with the first deity Yuanzhan. Tuobada and Helian Wuzhua frowned and muttered with displeasure. First deity Yuanzhan? Is he the eldest son of martial god Tianju? I heard he's a despicable person with a bad reputation. I think he was taught a lesson by Ji Tianxing. How strong is that guy? Do you have any intelligence or wisdom? Does he know how to plan? Don't tell me he's an ignorant and incompetent second generation. If he dares to act all high and mighty, I'll definitely beat him up. Jiangqi sighed and said, this mission is a deal between the three aristocratic families and Tianju divine nation. It's not something you and I can control. At this point we can only follow orders. Who dares to disobey? Even if Yuanzhan is a good-for-nothing, we have to follow him and protect him. Yi Lushui said that since we failed, we'll be responsible for protecting Yuanzhan. As long as Ji Tianxing dies, we'll have completed the mission and Xingyue Cave will be returned to us. Chapter 23:18. Thousands of miles away from the canyon, there was a lonely peak that was thousands of feet tall. Jiangqi, Helian Wuzhua, and Tuobada were standing under a towering ancient tree, waiting quietly. The sun rose to the middle of the sky. The sunlight shone through the dense leaves and fell on their faces. They were clearly impatient. About a quarter of an hour later, a few streaks of multicolored light flew over from afar. Swoosh! Swoosh! The flowing lights landed on the peak a few hundred feet away from them. Jiang Qi and the others looked over and saw 4 well-dressed young men and women with extraordinary auras. The leader was a young man with a tall stature. He wore a golden robe and a crown on his head. His pale face carried a hint of arrogance. Jiang Qi, Tuobada, and the others immediately guessed that the man in the golden robe was Yuanzhan, the first divine prince of heaven and holy nation. Following behind Yuanzhan was a young man in a green robe with a sword on his back. Jiang Qi, who practiced swordsmanship, always paid more attention to martial artists who practiced swordsmanship. He looked at the man a few more times. The other 2 were young and beautiful women. One wore a pink dress and looked charming. The other wore a yellow dress and looked dignified and beautiful. There were 4 people on each side and they were all young martial saints. Naturally, both sides stared at each other silently, sizing each other up from head to toe. Seeing that Yuanzhan and the others did not intend to speak, Jiang Qi and Tuobada looked at each other. Then Jiang Qi led the others to greet them. He stopped in front of Yuanzhan and the others and smiled. I am Jiang Qi, the young master of the Jiang family. Greetings to the first divine prince. I am Tuobada, the young master of the Tuoba family. Greetings to the first divine prince. I am Helian Wuzhua. Other than Tantai Xiener, the other 3 all said their names. But Yuanzhan's reaction was very calm. He only nodded slightly and looked at Tantai Xiener. Even though he had seen many beautiful women, he still could not hide his surprise when he saw Tantai Xiener for the first time. He looked at Tantai Xiener for a long time. Chao Ying's eyes dimmed when she saw this. Seeing Yuanzhan's reaction, Tuobada felt even more disgusted with him. He even felt a trace of enmity. Motherf *her, I've already guessed it. What bullsh *T great divine son. He's definitely just an embroidered pillow. I didn't think that not only is he arrogant and cold, he even dares to stare at Xian. This brat definitely has designs on Xian. I have to guard against him. Thinking of this, Tuobada reached out his arm and held Tantai Xian's waist. He had a smile on his face as he spoke to Yuanzhan. Your Highness, I'm really sorry. I forgot to introduce earlier. This is my wife Lin Xian. Yuanzhan was astute, so how could he not see through Tuobada's intentions? Immediately, a playful smile appeared on his face, and a trace of disdain flashed through his eyes. He withdrew his gaze from Tantai Xiener, pointed to the 3 young men and women behind him, and introduced them to Jiang Qi and others. Since we are going to work together, I will introduce them to you. This was Martial Saint Qingshan, the youngest Saint Emperor of the Heaven and Divine Nation. Is this Chan? Martial Saint, this is Martial Saint Chaoing. It will be more convenient for us to act after we get to know each other. Jiang Qi, Tuobada, and the other 2 clasped their hands and bowed to Martial Saint Qingshan and others. Everyone greeted each other and exchanged some pleasantries. After everyone had quietened down, Yuanzhan then said in a serious tone, I won't waste any more words. Everyone just needs to understand that we only have one goal in this operation, and that is to kill Ji Tianxing. At all costs and by all means. After saying that, Yuanzhan glanced at Jiang Qi and others, and said in a cold tone, before the operation, Commander Yi told me that if we invited the experts of the 3 aristocratic families, there would be no mistakes. However, I didn't expect the 3 aristocratic families to be so perfunctory and send a few young martial saints. Moreover, you have already acted on your own and confronted Ji Tianxing head-on, and lost to him. Hearing this, Jiang Qi, Tuobada, and the other 2's expressions changed. A strong sense of humiliation surged from their chests, and there was a hint of anger on their faces. Qingshan and Chen? The martial saints and the others looked at them with half-smiles, and there was a hint of mockery at the corners of their mouths. The atmosphere suddenly became awkward. Helian Wuzhua was more tactful, and he nodded with a smile. You are right, Sir Divine Child. We have indeed underestimated the enemy in this operation. We have lived overseas for a long time, and we do not understand the situation in Shenwu continent. We also did not expect Ji Tianxing to be so monstrous, which is why we have suffered such a great loss. However, since Commander Yi has come to us, he must have known that he is no match for Ji Tianxing. That is why he needs us to work together to complete the mission. What he meant was that they could not defeat Ji Tianxing, because they did not understand the situation and had underestimated the enemy. However, Yi Lushui and his group could not defeat Ji Tianxing either. Otherwise, why would he ask them for help? In any case, none of them could defeat Ji Tianxing, so why should they laugh at each other? It would be better for everyone to work together to deal with Ji Tianxing. Completing the mission was the most important thing. Yuan Zhan, Qingshan Martial Saint, and the others understood the meaning behind Helian Wujua's words, and could not help but look at him deeply. Yuan Zhan continued, Helian Wujua is right. I hope that all of you will remember that Ji Tianxing is not an ordinary martial saint. He is second only to the martial gods. Perhaps you have been trapped in the North Sea for a long time and have become frogs in a well. Now that you have suffered a loss, you should learn a lesson. From now on, you must not underestimate the enemy and listen to my orders. Otherwise, I can only ask you to leave, and there is no need to mention the Zingluna cave again. Everyone finally understood that these words were the main point. Yuan Zhan's previous words were just a prelude. This was his true motive. Jiang Qi, Tuobada, and Helian Wujua all frowned, and anger flashed in their eyes. However, the three quickly suppressed their anger and humiliation and remained calm and rational. There was nothing they could do. They had already failed once and had no right to bargain with Yuan Zhen. Seeing that the three of them remained silent, Yuan Zhen let out a satisfied smile and waved his hand. If there are no objections, we will depart now. After saying that, he took the lead and flew into the sky, leading everyone towards the canyon. A distance of 10,000 miles was not far for them. A short half an hour later, the group arrived at the Grand Canyon. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. The group passed through the white clouds and stopped in the sky outside the cave, observing the surroundings from above. Within 100 miles of the cave, there were more than 10 groups of martial artists hiding. Most of them were martial saints. Inside the cave, there were flashes of colorful lights and violent waves of dermic power. Yuan Zhan, Jiang Qi, and the others looked and saw Yunyao standing in the cave, holding two swords in a defensive posture. Ji Tianxing, on the other hand, was casting spells to break the seal with all his might. Chapter 23:19. Yuan Zhen frowned when he saw what was happening in the cave. Damn bastard! How dare he break the 5 seals at the entrance of the cave? How dare he try to break the divine seals in the illusory void mystery land? As he cursed in a low voice, a cold glint flashed in his eyes. His killing intent was obvious. Jiang Qi wanted to suggest that they attack when Ji Tianxing was breaking the seals. However, he recalled what Yuan Zhan had said before and decided to keep quiet. Martial Saint Qingshan thought for a while and said to Yuan Zhan, Your Highness, look at the dozens of people hiding in the valley. They are all intimidated by Ji Tianxing. No one dares to attack. Now that Ji Tianxing is trying his best to break the seals, it is the best time for us to attack him. Martial Saint Chan Yu nodded in agreement. That's right, Your Highness. This is the best opportunity. Moreover, once we attack Ji Tianxing, the martial saints hiding in the surroundings will take the opportunity to attack him. Even if Ji Tianxing has 3 heads and 6 arms, he will not be able to fend off the attacks of so many martial saints. Yuan Zhen frowned. After thinking for a while, he shook his head. This plan will not work. Firstly, we don't have enough people. We must wait for Lord Yi to come and join forces. Secondly, Ji Tianxing has just started to break the seals. He has not consumed much dermic power and is still very powerful. When he breaks the seals and uses up all his dermic power, he will be at his weakest. That will be the best time for us to attack him. At that time, he will be a fish on the chopping board. We can do whatever we want to him. So we have to wait patiently. After he finished speaking, Yuan Zhan revealed a confident smile. Martial Saint Qingshan and Martial Saint Chan Yu both nodded with admiration. So Your Highness has a plan. No wonder you are so confident. Is it because of our negligence? Your Highness is so thoughtful and has a flawless plan. Jiang Qi, Tuobada, and the others rolled their eyes in secret when they saw this scene, and they muttered in their hearts, What kind of bullsh**t plan is this? You call this a flawless plan? These 2 flatterers are so shameless to please Yuan Zhen. Yuan Zhen is indeed an idiot. surrounded by a bunch of sycophants and flatterers. Only Marshal St. Chowing did not express her opinion. She seemed to be deep in thought. After pondering for a moment, she asked Yuan Zhan, "Your Highness, the seal of the illusory void secret realm is a divine grade formation. Can Ji Tianxing break it?" Yuan Zhan sneered. With his martial sage realm strength, he shouldn't be able to break the deity grade seal. But don't forget his true identity. So, even if he breaks the seal, you don't have to be too surprised. Regardless of whether or not he can break the seal, he will exhaust all of his magic power and become weak. That will be the time of his death. Chowing nodded and said nothing more. Marshal St. Qingshan said to everyone, "Then let's follow the First Highness' wishes and wait patiently for an opportunity. Everyone keep quiet. Don't make any noise and wake up Ji Tianxing." Of course Chowing and Chun Yu would listen to him. Jiang Qi and the other two couldn't be bothered to meddle in other people's business, so they all maintained their silence. As for Tantai Xian she had the attitude of an outsider from beginning to end and had no intention of interfering. Ji Tianxing had been casting spells for 18 hours without any rest. Although he looked normal, his forehead was covered in sweat, and he had used up 30% of his magic power. He was mentally exhausted and his progress in breaking the seal had reached a temporary impasse. After a few failed attempts, he had no choice but to stop casting spells temporarily. He stopped casting spells and stared at the 5-colored light screen. He frowned and fell into deep thought. At this moment Yunyao, who was not far away, looked at him with concern. She sent a voice transmission, "Tianxing, don't be so anxious. Take a rest first. There are more than 100 martial artists outside. We have to be extra careful." Ji Tianxing nodded. He turned around and sat down beside her. He took an elixir to recover his magic power. As he refined the elixir, he said to Yunyao, "Equipment forging and formation Dao complement each other. Martial God Nangong is proficient in forging divine artifacts, and his attainments in formation Dao are profound. The illusory sky secret realm is his cave residence. The divine formation that seals the secret realm was set up by him with all his knowledge. Even if I am proficient in thousands of divine formations and can deduce the way to break this formation, it will still take me 4 to 5 days to open it." Yunyao nodded to show that she understood. She asked with concern, "What if I help you and we work together to break it? How many days will it take?" Ji Tianxing thought for a while and answered, "About 3 days." Yunyao turned her head and looked at the sky outside the cave. She said with a worried expression, "If we work together to break the formation, we will give those people a chance. Unless we chase those martial artists away, we won't have a chance." Ji Tianxing also understood this point. He looked outside the cave with a serious expression. He released his divine sense and extended it out of the cave to check the situation around him. He wanted to see how many martial artists were hiding in the valley, and how many martial saints were among them. The invisible divine sense spread out in the valley, and soon covered a radius of 200 miles. Ji Tianxing immediately found that there were 19 groups of martial artists around him. There were more than 70 martial saints. Among them, a group of people immediately attracted his attention. There were 8 people in that group and they were all martial saints. When he used his divine sense to see the appearance of the 8 martial saints, he was stunned. Yuan Zhan? Martial saints Qingshan and Chen Yu? And Tantai Xian and the 3 disciples of the aristocratic families? Ji Tianxing murmured in a low voice. He immediately revealed a mocking smile. "Haha, the people of the 3 aristocratic families are indeed manipulated by the Heaven Extinction Divine Nation. They are actually with Yuan Zhan. 8 martial saints gathered together? Are they trying to sneak up on me while I am breaking the seal?" As he spoke, he stood up and walked out of the cave. Yunyao quickly followed him and asked with concern, "Tianxing, there are many martial artists in the valley now. Are you really going to attack in public?" "Of course," Ji Tianxing said without hesitation. "Isn't this a good way to make an example of them and scare off the flies in the surroundings?" After he spoke, he turned into a beam of golden light and flew out of the cave. He rushed into the sky as fast as lightning. Whoosh! With a flash of golden light, Ji Tianxing entered the clouds and appeared before Yuan Zhan and the others. Yuan Zhan, Jiang Qi, and the others were waiting patiently, looking bored. No one expected that Ji Tianqing, who was breaking the seal in the cave, would suddenly appear before them. When everyone recovered their wits, they were startled. They all showed vigilant and guarded expressions and subconsciously took a few steps back. Ji Tianqing looked at Yuan Zhan with a mocking expression and said with a cold smile, "Yuan Zhan, you are already notorious. Your name has spread throughout the continent. You still have the face to come out?" Chapter 23:20. Hearing Yuan Zhan's words, Ji Tianqing's sneer deepened. "What's the big deal with being humiliated? Since you don't know what's good for you and still dare to seek revenge from me, I'll give you another word." "What word?" Yuan Zhan asked subconsciously. "Die." Ji Tianqing shouted coldly. A black light flashed in his right hand, and the sword of burial of heaven appeared. In the next moment he waved the sword of burial of heaven without any explanation, stabbing a cold light that filled the sky towards Yuan Zhan. Yuan Zhan had already overestimated Ji Tianqing. However, he had not expected that Ji Tianqing would be so unbridled even with 7 martial sages behind him, killing him at the slightest disagreement. He was simply too arrogant and condescending. Yuan Zhan's anger and killing intent surged to the heavens. Without hesitation, he drew his sword and waved it to block. Clang! 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 The sword lights that filled the sky collided. The two swords clashed, and a clear and crisp sound of collision burst forth. An incomparably violent force attacked, shaking Yuan Zhan and sending him flying backward on the spot. His complexion was as pale as paper. At the same time, the 3 martial saints Qing Shan, Chan Yu and Chao Ying all let out angry roars, brandishing their swords and sabers as they charged towards Ji Tianqing. "Audacious thief, hand over your life." "Ji Tianqing, I want your dog life. Since you're courting death, we'll fulfill your wish." In a split second, the overwhelming radiance of blades and swords, as well as the colorful brilliance of spells, drowned Ji Tianqing's figure like a monstrous flood. Paragon sword body. Ji Tianqing was fearless. His entire body lit up with black light, and his body turned into a huge black vortex. Swish! Swish! The saber lights and sword shadows that filled the sky fell into the vortex and were immediately swallowed up. In the next moment, the attacks of the 3 martial saints disappeared into thin air, and Ji Tianqing appeared unscathed. Not only did the 3 of them fail to injure him, they were even refined into magic power for his own use. 7-star sword. Ji Tianqing angrily roared again, waving the burial of heaven sword and thrusting out 49 sword beams, enveloping Qing Shan, Chan Yu and Chao Ying. The 3 of them were shocked. They hurriedly brandished their swords and sabers, casting spells with all their might to resist. But it was futile. Pung! 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 A series of muffled sounds rang out, and the 3 of them were sent flying by the starry sword light. The 3 of them had suffered heavy injuries. There were at least 4 or 5 wounds on their bodies, all of which were so deep that their bones could be seen. The most miserable one was Martial Saint Qing Shan. His entire left leg was chopped off, and he let out a heart-wrenching scream. After repelling the 3 with a single sword strike, Ji Tianqing charged at Yuan Zhan with his sword in hand. Jiang Qi, Tuobada, and Helian Wuzhua could not just stand by and watch. They had no choice but to step forward. The 3 of them each performed their own unique skills, controlling 2 swords, 1 cauldron, and 2 millstone axes, charging towards Ji Tianqing with an imposing aura. However, a cold starlight flew over from the side, blooming into thousands of starlight sword flowers. "Your opponent is me." As the silver sword flowers bloomed, Yun Yao's clear and cold voice rang out, echoing in the sky. Pung! 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 Another series of muffled sounds rang out, reverberating in the valley. The violent force exploded, dispersing the clouds and mist within a radius of 100 miles. Jiang Qi, Tuobada, and Helian Wuzhua had not recovered from their injuries, so they were still weak. After exchanging a blow, they were actually pushed back 1,000 feet by Yun Yao. Their aura was also stagnant. Before they could regain their composure, Yun Yao waved her silver moon dual swords and launched an attack at them. Therefore, the three of them could only focus on dealing with Yun Yao's fierce attacks with all their might. Ji Tianqing took this opportunity to attack Yuan Zhen. Heaven-splitting sword. Ji Tianqing held the sword of burial of heaven with both hands and slashed out 1,000 feet long starry sword, descending from the sky. Before the giant sword arrived, the terrifying sword intent had already locked onto Yuan Zhen's divine soul, filling him with terror and fear. He knew that he could not block the giant sword's attack, so he hurriedly retreated while wielding his sword to block. Not far away, Qing Shan, Chaoying, and Chun Yu rushed over, but they were too late to help. Kaboom! Amidst the thunder-like explosion, Yuan Zhen's sword light was shattered, and the 1,000 feet long giant sword landed on him. Suddenly, the golden robe and soft armor he wore shattered into countless pieces and scattered in the sky. He was also sent flying, and a 2-foot-long wound appeared on his chest, spurting out a large amount of blood. If it were not for his dermic power shield and soft armor that blocked part of the power, he would have been cut in half by the giant sword. After flying 15 miles, he barely managed to stop. His face was full of pain and fear flashed in his eyes. He could not care less about roaring and cursing, and hurriedly channeled his energy to suppress his injuries. However, Ji Tianqing did not spare him. He was determined to kill him, so he attacked again with his sword. Yuan Zhen, you can go die now. Ji Tianqing roared. He raised the burial of heaven again and slashed down. Another giant sword, which was thousands of feet long, formed by 5-colored lightning, drowned Yuan Zhen's figure with endless divine power. Yuan Zhen was heavily injured, and he was suppressed by the giant sword's power. He could not dodge at all. He was about to be killed by the giant sword. At this critical moment, a light yellow figure flew in from the side and blocked in front of him without any regard for its own safety. Bang! A deafening muffled sound burst out, echoing endlessly in the canyon. The slightly thin and weak light yellow figure was split in half by the giant sword on the spot, and blood splattered all over the sky. Yuan Zhen was also pushed back by the violent impact, and he rolled and crashed into a cliff 10 miles away. Even though his injuries were worse, and he was in so much pain that his body twitched, he forgot about the pain. However, he had completely forgotten about his pain. His eyes were bloodshot as he stared at the 2 halves of the corpse falling from the sky. When he saw the corpse's appearance, his body stiffened, and his expression became extremely ugly. It was Marshal Saint Chaoying. It was that quiet, elegant, and dignified woman. Yuan Zhen knew that Chaoying had feelings for him for a long time. However, he did not take Chaoying seriously, and had never responded to her advances. He was the great divine son of the heavens and holy nation, and the future ruler of the holy nation. How noble was his status! Chaoying was only a descendant of a hidden sect, and her beauty was only above average. She was not a beauty, nor was she a noble figure from a prestigious family. How could she be worthy of him? However, Yuan Zhen did not expect that the person who saved him when his life was hanging by a thread would be Chaoying. It was not Marshal Saint Qingshan, who was most loyal to him, or Marshal Saint Chanyue, who respected him greatly. It was the most silent and ordinary Chaoying. At that moment, Yuan Zhen realized his mistake, and his heart was filled with deep regret. However, it was too late. Chaoying's corpse fell quickly into the valley, and was buried by the ruins. Her white spiritual soul was severely injured, and it was unconscious, floating in the air like a cloud. Yuan Zhen woke up immediately, and rushed to the spiritual soul crazily muttering, "No, Chaoying is not dead. Her spiritual soul is still here. I can't let her die, I can't." At that moment, he used all his strength to rush over, and held Chaoying's spiritual soul in his hands. Then he turned around and ran away without hesitation. Chapter 23-21. Marshal Saint Qingshan and Marshal Saint Chanyue were filled with fear after witnessing Chaoying's body being destroyed. When they saw Yuan Zhen running away, they followed him subconsciously. However, what Yuan Zhen said before leaving instantly caused their bodies to stiffen, and their expressions became extremely unsightly. Their thoughts of running away were extinguished on the spot, and their hearts were filled with despair. Yuan Zhen's words were not a request, but an order. If they dared to disobey with Yuan Zhan's nature, he might really kill them. However, they were both subjects of the heaven and divine nation, and they could not go against Yuan Zhan. After hesitating for a moment, they could only accept their fate. Even if they braced themselves and were prepared to die, the two of them could only face Ji Tianqing head-on and unleash their strongest attacks. One sword breaks Qingshan. Flying flowers fill the sky. Marshal Saint Qingshan waved his sword and slashed out a giant green sword that could split heaven and earth, charging toward Ji Tianqing. Marshal Saint Qinyue's sleeves fluttered, and pink flowers covered the sky. They surrounded Ji Tianqing like a rain of flowers and exploded. They knew Ji Tianqing's strength very well, and they did not dare to hope that these two secret techniques could injure or kill Ji Tianqing. They only hoped to delay him for a moment. As long as they could cover Yuan Zhan's retreat, their mission would be completed. Bang! 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 Ji Tianqing waved his sword and slashed out hundreds of sword lights, shattering the rain of flowers. He then raised his left hand and threw out a star-shattering fist, shattering the giant green sword. In the blink of an eye, Marshal Saint Qingshan and Marshal Saint Qinyue's attacks were easily neutralized. Then, he waved the Burial of Heaven sword and slashed out a giant sword made of 5-colored divine lightning. Kaboom! With a thunderous explosion, the giant sword of lightning hit Marshal Saint Qingshan. Marshal Saint Qingshan was instantly wrapped by the 5-colored divine lightning, and his entire body was charred black. Black smoke rose in spirals, making him look like a piece of charcoal. The incomparably violent impact caused his entire body to split open and spurt out pitch-black, filthy blood. His entire body flew backward, drawing an arc in the sky before crashing into the ruins 30 miles away. Marshal Saint Qinyue saw Marshal Saint Qingshan being severely injured with her own eyes. She was so shocked that she forgot about Yuan Zhan's order. Without hesitation, she turned around and flew towards the northwest. However, Ji Tianqing did not let her go. He waved his left hand and shot out a dazzling golden light. Heaven-capturing dragon claw. The golden light that covered the sky condensed into a giant dragon claw that was the size of a mountain. It descended from the sky and enveloped Marshal Saint Qinyue. Marshal Saint Qinyue was horrified. She tried her best to teleport away, trying to escape the dragon claw's attack. However, the space within a radius of dozens of miles had been sealed. She couldn't teleport at all. Boom! Amidst the deafening muffled sound, Marshal Saint Qinyue was ruthlessly slammed by the heaven-capturing dragon claw. She spat out a mouthful of blood as she crashed into the ruins, causing dust to fill the air. Her body was covered with cracks and wounds, like a broken porcelain bowl. Dark red blood gushed out from dozens of wounds, drenching her entire body. Endless dust enveloped her, making her look extremely miserable. In just a few breaths' time, Qingshan and Chan Yu were defeated and heavily injured. Both of them were powerless to stop Ji Tianqing. They could only endure their injuries and crawl out of the ruins, fleeing towards the two sides of the canyon. Ji Tianqing wanted to chase after Yuan Zhan. However, he had already wasted 10 breaths' time in order to deal with Qingshan and Chan Yu. Now, when he went to chase after Yuan Zhan again, he couldn't even see his shadow. Helplessly, he could only give up on chasing after Yuan Zhan and vent all his anger on Qingshan and Chan Yu. Seeing Marshal Saint Qingshan fly across the sky, wanting to take the opportunity to escape, he stabbed out a few starry sword lights without hesitation. 7-star sword. Whoosh whoosh whoosh. 7 starry sword lights streaked across the sky and instantly pierced the charred Marshal Saint Qingshan. At the moment of life and death, a determined look flashed across Marshal Saint Qingshan's eyes. He immediately made up his mind and took out a huge dark golden battle flag, blocking in front of him like a wall. Whoosh whoosh whoosh. The incomparably sharp starlight sword light pierced the golden battle flag one after another, cutting the huge battle flag into a dozen pieces. This battle flag was Marshal Saint Qingshan's trump card, a high-grade sacred artifact with special effects. He rarely used it. Now that it was a matter of life and death, he could only reluctantly take it out. The result was just as he expected. The battle flag blocked the sword lights but was torn into pieces. Fortunately, Marshal Saint Qingshan dodged the calamity. His strong desire to survive caused him to erupt with unlimited potential, and his fleeing speed increased by 2 times. Whoosh! In the blink of an eye, he traversed hundreds of miles of sky and disappeared into the depths of the clouds. Ji Tianqing didn't chase after him. Instead, he turned and attacked Marshal St. Chanyu. Marshal St. Chanyu's injuries were very serious. After barely escaping 400 miles, Ji Tianqing caught up with him. Piercing sword. Ji Tianqing held the Heaven's Burier sword and pierced through the air, aiming directly at Marshal St. Chanyu's back. Marshal St. Chanyu's divine soul was instantly locked by the terrifying sword will. Her body also became stiff. Her eyes were filled with despair. She had a premonition that death was coming. However, she wasn't as lucky as Marshal St. Qingshan. She also didn't have a powerful trump card. Her ending was already decided. Bam! With a muffled sound, a cold light pierced through Marshal St. Chanyu's back and exploded in her chest. A huge silver mushroom cloud rose into the sky, illuminating the canyon for hundreds of miles. Marshal Sacred Chinyue's body was shattered into pieces on the spot, which fell from the sky into thousands of pieces. Even her divine soul had been blown into dozens of pieces, floating in the air like white spots of light. Marshal St. Chanyu, who had charmed countless nobles and experts and had countless men under her skirt, died just like that. Ji Tianqing didn't even bother to look at her. He turned and attacked Jiang Qi, Tuobada, and the others. The three descendants of the aristocratic families were attacking Yun Yao. They were actually in a stalemate and wouldn't end in a short time. Of course, Yun Yao had the upper hand. She wasn't injured at all. On the other hand, Jiang Qi, Tuobada, and Helian Wujua's injuries became more serious and their powers became weaker. Ji Tianqing rushed to the battlefield and glanced at the sky 100 miles away. He saw Tantai standing on top of a huge rock on the cliff and watching the fight from afar. She acted as if this matter had nothing to do with her, and was just watching the fire burn across the river. She had no intention of interfering. Seeing this, Ji Tianqing's sharp eyes became gentler. If Tantai dared to attack Yun Yao, he would never let her go. Heaven-breaking sword. While Jiang Qi and the other two were fighting with Yun Yao, Ji Tianqing suddenly teleported behind Tuobada and slashed with his sword. The huge golden sword that was 100 feet long descended on Tuobada's head with the power to destroy everything. Tuobada was taken aback. His eyes were filled with fear. Chapter 23-22. Bam! Amidst the deafening noise, the huge golden sword struck Tuobada's double axes. The two axes were sent flying, and the giant sword was also shattered. Tuobada was sent flying, and his back collided with Yun Yao's dozens of sword auras. Swoosh! Swoosh! In the blink of an eye, dozens of bloody holes appeared on his back, and blood splattered everywhere. The sudden pain made him roar into the sky, and he let out a blood-curdling scream. Before he could stabilize his body, Ji Tianqing slapped another huge golden palm at him. Bam! Tuobada was hit by the golden palm, and he was sent flying dozens of miles away. He crashed into the cliff at the edge of the valley, and rocks were sent flying everywhere. Jiang Qi and Helian Wujua saw that Ji Tianqing had joined the battle and severely injured Tuobada in one move, and they wanted to retreat. Both of them made a feint, and after forcing Yun Yao to retreat, they ran as fast as they could. Ji Tianqing quickly chased after them, and punched at Helian Wujua, and slashed at Jiang Qi with his sword. Both of them had no choice but to cast spells to block. Bam! Bam! With a dull thud, both of them were sent flying, and they spat out blood as they crashed into the ruins. Before they could recover, Yun Yao attacked again with her sword, and hundreds of sword auras were sent flying. Swish! 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 Jiang Qi and Helian Wujua were infuriated. They could only endure their injuries and take out their Dharma treasures to block. The purple and green dual swords and an octagonal golden cauldron flew out, shining brightly, and blocked in front of them. The sword auras pierced the dual swords and the golden cauldron, and a series of crisp sounds were heard. Cling! Clang! Clang! After an intense collision, the purple and green dual swords and the golden cauldron dimmed, and they fell in front of the two weakly. At this moment, Ji Tianqing attacked again, and sent out dozens of golden sword auras. Even though Jiang Qi and Helian Wujua tried their best to block, they were still stabbed a few times, and a few bloody holes appeared on their bodies and blood splattered everywhere. The two of them knew that they couldn't stay here any longer. Otherwise, they would have to endure the continuous attacks of Ji Tianqing and Yu Niao. They would be killed within a few moves. As a result, the two of them made up their minds and used all their strength to activate the azulate swords and octagonal golden cauldron to attack Ji Tianqing and Yu Niao. While the couple was casting spells to defend themselves, the two of them turned around and fled without hesitation. 2 breaths later, Ji Tianqing broke the twin swords while Yu Niao shattered the octagonal golden cauldron. The broken sword and the fragments of the golden furnace fell from the sky and smashed into the canyon. However, Jiang Qi and Helian Wuzhua had already escaped far away. Even if Ji Tianqing and Yu Niao chased after them, it would be very difficult for them to catch up in a short period of time. The couple then looked at the ruins 100 miles away. They wanted to kill the heavily injured Tuobada unexpectedly. Tuobada had already fled under the cover of Tantai Xia and vanished without a trace. As a result of the 7 martial saints that Yuan Zhan brought, other than Chen, the martial saint was killed on the spot. Chao Ying's physical body was destroyed, and the other 5 escaped. Ji Tianqing furrowed his brows and said angrily, "Damn it! I wanted to kill them all, but I didn't expect them to escape." Yu Niao put away the twin swords and comforted him with a calm expression. "If you insist on chasing after any martial saints, you can definitely catch up and kill them. However, if you do that, not only will you waste time, you will also put yourself in danger. When we were fighting just now, the dozens of martial saints around us were a little restless. Fortunately, we defeated Yuan Zhan and the rest easily, so those people were intimidated. Look, those dozen or so groups of martial artists are very fearful and have all retreated to a further place." Ji Tianqing looked around for a moment and found that those martial saints had indeed retreated and stopped looking at them. Yu Niao continued, "You don't have to worry. This result is quite good. Yuan Zhan's people are either dead or injured, and they have all fled. They won't be able to come back in a short time. When they recover from their injuries and come back for revenge, we will have broken the seal and entered the secret realm. When we get martial god Nangong's treasures and divine weapons, killing them will be as easy as flipping our hands." Ji Tianqing nodded and said, "Yes, it seems like this is the only way now. Yuan Zhan's people have all fled, and the surrounding martial saints are also intimidated. They won't dare to attack us again. Now that the situation is settled, I can break the seal with peace of mind." Then he turned and flew back into the cave. He took out some medicinal pills and consumed them to recover his magic power. Yu Niao landed beside him and also consumed some medicinal pills to recover her magic power. 6 hours later, the two of them had refined the medicinal power, and their magic power and mental state had both recovered. Then, the two of them began to work together to break the seal. Although the divine level seal was strong, Ji Tianqing was familiar with thousands of divine level formations and had already deduced the way to break it. Yu Niao helped him wholeheartedly. She started to cast spells according to his instructions and shot out streaks of dazzling light. The two of them were so focused on casting spells to break the seal that they completely forgot about the passage of time. Unknowingly, 2 days had passed. Although the two of them had been breaking the seal, the martial saints in the valley were too intimidated and didn't dare to have any evil thoughts. Even an expert like Yuan Zhan, who had led 7 martial saints to besiege Ji Tianqing and his wife, had still ended up with heavy casualties. Among the martial saints in the valley, who dared to come to their deaths. Soon another day had passed. For 3 whole days, Ji Tianqing and Yu Niao had been focused on breaking the seal and hadn't rested at all. The two of them had consumed a lot of their spiritual energy and magic power. Their faces were pale, and beads of sweat appeared on their foreheads. However, the 5-colored light curtain had become thinner, and its light was also gradually dimming. Success was right in front of them. No matter how tired they were, they would grit their teeth and persevere. Finally, on the evening of the 4th day, the 5-colored light curtain that sealed the cave completely disappeared. Whoosh! The 5-colored light quickly shrunk until it completely disappeared, and the cave was instantly plunged into darkness. Ji Tianqing had successfully broken the illusory void secret realm's deity seal. Ji Tianqing and Yu Niao slowly stopped and looked at each other with gratified smiles. Phew! I underestimated this ceiling formation. Even after 4,000 years, it still retains 70% of its power. It's really not simple. President Jitian heaved a sigh of relief and lamented. Yunyao raised her hand to wipe away the sweat on her forehead and said expectantly, "In the current Xinwu continent, besides the three martial gods, you are the only one who can successfully break a deity seal. If we can obtain a powerful deity weapon, we will be qualified to compete with the martial gods." Ji Tianqing nodded and smiled. "I wonder what martial god Nangong's cave looks like. What treasures are hidden inside? Let's go in and take a look." As he spoke, he took out the sword of burial of heaven and led the way into the depths of the cave. Yunyao held her silver moon swords and followed closely behind him. She was always on guard against their surroundings. Although martial god Nangong's cave might contain deity weapons and treasures, it was still very likely that the cave would contain deity weapons and treasures. Chapter 23-23. At first, Ji Tianqing thought that martial god Nangong's cave abode was a ruin buried deep underground. But later he realized that wasn't the case. At the end of the cold and dark cave was a starlight disk with a radius of 10 feet. It was a teleportation array that led to an unknown place. There were hundreds of intersecting golden light lines in the disk, which divided it into 365 cells. Every grid was of the same size, and all of them were surging with white starlight, constantly flickering. Ji Tianqing knew that the disk was the heavenly cycle stellar disk, which corresponded to the stars in the sky, and contained the secrets of the heavenly cycle stellar disk. If one wasn't a martial god, they wouldn't be able to study it thoroughly, let alone set it up and use it. Even a martial god would have to spend hundreds or thousands of years to understand the secrets of the heavenly cycle stellar array and open or close it. Fortunately, Ji Tianqing was knowledgeable and his memory was as vast as the sea. He had also mastered the secrets of the heavenly cycle stellar array to an extremely high level. After all, the heavenly cycle stellar array was the foundation of many divine arrays. "Yao Yao, wait here for a while. I'll be able to crack this teleportation array soon," he warned Yunyao, and then began to cast a spell to break open the formation. Yunyao took a few steps back and guarded Ji Tianqing with the silver moon swords while secretly recovering her dharma power. Swish, swish, swish. Ji Tianqing put away the sword of burial of heaven and formed a sword art with both hands. He kept shooting out silver sword auras into the heavenly cycle stellar array. Suddenly, the starlight disk started to move. The 360 cells flashed with starlight and kept changing their positions. This divine formation contained boundless profundities. It contained over 99,000 transformations, and it was extremely complicated and profound. But Ji Tianqing knew this array like the back of his hand. He didn't slow down at all. As his casting speed increased, the starlight disk spun faster and faster. Gradually, it became dazzling and colorful. The surging divine power gushed out like a tide and poured into the canyon through the cave. For a time, the canyon within a radius of a few hundred kilometers was filled with dense silver dots of light. It was a dreamy and blurry scene. The dozen or so groups of martial practitioners hiding in the canyon all discovered the anomaly. Everyone immediately became lively, and their curiosity was piqued. Many martial sages tried to release their divine senses into the cave to see what was going on. Waves of whispers and discussions also sounded in the crowd. "Strange, why is there so much starlight gushing out from that cave? Such pure and mighty energy is definitely not something that a martial saint can control. Could this be divine energy?" There's no martial god realm expert here. Only the god-level formation of the illusionary mystical ground is capable of unleashing the god force. Ji Tianqing seems to have broken the seal of the illusory void secret realm. Unbelievable. He is only a martial sage, but he is able to break the deity grade seal. I am very sure that he is the reincarnation of Kenshin. Otherwise, he would not be so powerful. It seems like he has not entered the illusionary void secret realm. There seems to be an array in the cave. I really want to enter the cave to see what is going on. However, Ji Tianqing is too cruel and merciless. He will kill us if he doesn't agree with us. Let alone entering the cave. We don't even dare to use our divine senses to check on him. If we anger him, we will definitely die. Many martial sages were hesitant and conflicted. Everyone wanted to see what was going on, but no one dared to take a step forward. Unknowingly, 10 hours had passed. Ji Tianqing continued to cast his skills and shot out tens of thousands of starlight sword radiances. He had successfully opened the ancient sky star array. Swoosh! The starlight disk stopped moving, and the starlight in the 365 grids gathered together, forming a silvery white light gate that was more than 10 feet tall. The mysterious silver light door stood quietly in the cave, and no one knew where it led to. Ji Tianqing looked a little tired, but he was very excited. His eyes were filled with anticipation. We will enter the illusionary void's secret realm after we cross this teleportation formation. Yao Yao, let's go. After saying that, he stepped into the teleportation formation. Yun Yao followed closely behind. She stepped into the teleportation formation and disappeared with a swoosh. After the two of them left, the cave became silent. However, the white light door still stood in the darkness and exuded a majestic and sacred aura. Half an hour later, more than 10 groups of martial artists hiding in the valley could not hold back their curiosity when they saw that there was no movement in the cave. A red-haired martial sage mustered up his courage and released his divine senses into the cave. Soon, he saw that there was no one in the cave except for a tall white light door. Ji Tianqing is gone. He must have entered the illusionary void's secret realm. That teleportation formation is the real entrance. The red-haired martial sage was shocked and shouted in surprise. His companion was also overjoyed and said excitedly, "Then what are we waiting for? Let's go in. Even if Ji Tianqing is going to eat the meat, we can still drink the soup." The two of them immediately reached a consensus. They flew across the sky at lightning speed and entered the cave. When the other groups of martial artists saw that the two martial sages had entered the cave without fear of death, they could not hold back their curiosity. Many of them released their divine senses to check the situation in the cave. When they realized that Ji Tianqing had disappeared and that there was a teleportation formation in the cave, they instantly became excited. Ji Tianqing and his wife have already opened the illusionary void's secret realm. They have already entered the secret realm. How can we be left behind? Ha ha ha. We have waited for so long. Finally, we see hope. Ji Tianqing will clear the obstacles in front, and we will follow behind to pick up the leftovers. This is perfect. More than 10 groups of martial artists were overjoyed and dashed into the cave without caring about their own safety. In less than 15 minutes, 18 groups of people, more than 100 powerhouses, had rushed into the cave and entered the illusionary void's secret realm. The valley, which had been filled with an oppressive atmosphere and danger, immediately became quiet. At this moment, two figures flew down from the mountain peak and landed at the entrance of the cave. They were two middle-aged men and they were both top martial sages. The man on the left was wearing a purple robe. He had a handsome face and long white hair. There was a purple sword-shaped mark on his forehead. The man on the right was wearing a black robe and a large cloak that covered his entire face. His appearance could not be seen clearly. The two of them stood side by side and looked coldly at the entrance of the cave. The man in the purple robe on the left said, "Alliance leader Wu, you guessed right. He has really broken the seal of the secret realm." The man in the black robe, who was called Alliance leader Wu, said indifferently, "Commander Yi, both of us know his true identity. Isn't it normal for him to be able to accomplish such a miracle?" Commander Yi nodded slightly and said in a cold voice, "We have been observing from afar for 5 days and have been waiting patiently for an opportunity. In these 5 days, he has been breaking the divine array and has not rested at all. Now his powers must be depleted." Chapter 23-24. In the illusory void's secret realm. It was an alternate space with a radius of 90,000 miles. Just like the divine kingdoms of the three martial gods, it was not in the five elements world but was closely connected to it. In the blue sky there were white clouds and dazzling golden radiance. On the vast land, there were mountains, rivers, grasslands, and two mirror-like lakes. Ji Tianqing and Yunyao stood high in the sky and looked down at the land below. The two of them were in the center of the illusory void secret realm. Under their feet was a 10,000-mile-long mountain range. It looked like a giant dragon lying on the ground. The strange thing was that the mountain range was not straight. Instead, it was twisted like a snake. To the east of the mountain range was an endless silver-white grassland. The ground was covered with star grass and silver rice flowers, which were rare herbs on the continent. On the silver-white grassland, there was a dark green lake, which formed a strong contrast with the grassland around it. To the west of the mountain range was a lush primitive forest, which was dark green in color. In the middle of the forest there was a crystal-clear lake, which looked like a mirror. Ji Tianqing looked down at the land. He looked at the mountain range, grassland, forest and two lakes, which formed a strange scene. He immediately smiled. Haha. It seems like martial god Nangong mainly cultivated artifact forging and array Dao. He couldn't break through to the martial god realm, so he switched to the Dao of Yin and Yang and tried to ascend to the upper realm. Yunyao raised her eyebrows and asked curiously, "Why do you say that?" Ji Tianqing pointed at the mountain range and the land under his feet and explained, "Look at this land. Doesn't it look like a huge yin and yang diagram? The mountain range under our feet is the boundary of the yin and yang diagram. The silver-white grassland in the east is close to white, which represents yang. As for the dark green lake, it was yin within yang. As for the dark green forest in the west, it's close to black, which represents yin. The lake in the forest is one that is negative to yin and embraces yang." After listening to Ji Tianqing's explanation, Yunyao was enlightened. She nodded and said, "It's really a huge yin and yang diagram. That Nangong martial god is really generous. He actually used the entire illusory void secret realm as a formation disk and set up a yin-yang layout." Ji Tianqing nodded and sighed with some regret. Although the idea was good, he failed in the end. In fact, there were 3,000 great Daos in the world that could be connected to the divine. The Dao of Yin and Yang was one of them. However, the reason Nangong martial god failed to ascend to the upper realm is not because of him. Yunyao understood what he meant and didn't say much. She pointed at the mountain range below and said, "I just saw a few palaces and pagodas in the mountain range. It should be the residence of Nangong martial god. Let's go down and take a look. Let's explore the area before those martial sages arrive." "Okay," Ji Tianqing responded and flew towards the mountain range with Yunyao. On the 10,000 miles long mountain range, there were a total of 9 mountains, each over 10,000 feet tall. There was a palace or a pagoda on top of each mountain. Ji Tianqing and Yunyao landed on the southernmost mountain peak and stood outside a simple and majestic palace. This palace had 3 floors and was 3,000 feet tall. It was completely built with fiery red earth core spiritual jade. Probably no one had been here for thousands of years. The palace and the square in front of the palace were covered with a thick layer of dust. Ji Tianqing and Yunyao crossed the square and walked to the front of the palace's gate. The vermilion gate was tightly shut. There were lifelike dragon and phoenix patterns carved on the gate, and it was sealed by a divine-level formation. Fortunately, this was just an ordinary divine-level formation. It wasn't too complicated. Ji Tianqing spent an hour to decipher it. They pushed open the heavy gate and stepped into the palace. The layout of the palace was very orderly. The main hall was in the middle and there were side halls, guest rooms, and parlors on both sides. Behind the main hall was a study room, a side room, a secret room, and so on. Ji Tianqing and Yunyao looked around the palace and realized that it was empty. There were no living people and no rare treasures. The slightly valuable things were the carvings on the walls and the lamps. They were all made of precious gemstones. Of course, the most valuable treasures were actually the few formation diagrams in the secret room. They were all divine-level formations created by martial god Nangong himself. His experience and knowledge were recorded on them. Ji Tianqing glanced at them and realized that they were all virtual god-level formations. They were not worth mentioning. Moreover, 2 of the formations were not simple enough. There were some flaws and loopholes. He didn't care about these formation diagrams since they were worthless to him. However, he didn't want these divine-level formation diagrams to fall into the hands of others. He put them into his spatial ring and threw them in a corner. 15 minutes later, Ji Tianqing and Yunyao walked out of the main hall. They flew into the sky and rushed to the second mountain peak that was thousands of miles away. The building on this mountain peak was not a palace. Instead, it was a 6,000 feet tall pagoda. The pagoda was dark gold in color. Even though it was covered in a layer of dust, it still shone brightly under the sun. The pagoda had 3 floors. The entrance was sealed with a divine level formation. Ji Tianqing spent an hour to break the seal. After entering the pagoda, his furrowed brows relaxed. This pagoda was a material warehouse. It stored countless rare materials for refining weapons. There were all kinds of rare metals, ores, and gemstones. There were also claws, teeth, and bones of ancient mutated beasts. It was a dazzling array. Most importantly, the pagoda had a divine level formation seal. It could greatly reduce the corrosion of time and delay the decay of the materials. More than 70% of the materials could still be used normally. Ji Tianqing didn't hold back. He swept through the first floor to the third floor of the pagoda and took away all the usable materials. When he and Yunyao left the pagoda, there were a few mountains of materials worth 1 billion in his spatial ring. Then they rushed to the third mountain peak. At the top of this mountain peak, there was a green-brown palace hidden by towering ancient trees. This palace seemed to be the place where Nangong martial god refined pills. Not only were there dozens of cauldrons and cauldrons, but there was also a large number of rare herbs. Ji Tianqing took away all the useful and expensive herbs. Then, he went to study the cauldrons and cauldrons. There were more than 30 cauldrons. They were all saint-level Dharma treasures. The highest quality one was a saint-level phoenix feather cauldron. Ji Tianqing was a little disappointed. He thought to himself that Nangong martial god was proficient in refining weapons and arrays. Alchemy was definitely his weak point. So, he only took the phoenix feather cauldron and gave it to Yunyao. Even if he didn't use it to refine pills, it would be good for self-defense. When they arrived at the fourth mountain peak, someone had already reached it. 3 older martial sages were gathered at the entrance of the ancient palace. A white-haired old man with a bow and arrow stood guard outside the gate, keeping a lookout. The other 2 burly old men in purple robes were studying the sealing array with full concentration. They looked like they were racking their brains. Chapter 23-25. The 3 martial sages rushed into the cave with dozens of other martial artists and arrived at the illusory void secret land. As the saying goes, the older you are, the wiser you are. The 3 of them had lived for thousands of years and had seen many things. They had explored many secret lands and relics and had rich experience in exploring. Therefore, after they entered the illusory void secret land, they did not stop at the border but went straight to the mountain range in the middle. They knew that if there were any treasures or buildings in the secret land, they would be in the middle. As it turned out, the 3 of them were right. When they landed in the mountain range, they found a palace. The simple and solemn palace exuded a majestic aura. It was obvious that there were treasures hidden there. However, after a long time, the 3 of them still could not open the seal of the palace. They had just found a clue when Ji Tianqing and Yunyao came again. The 3 of them could only take out their weapons and stare at Ji Tianqing and his wife warily. Ji Tianqing walked to the gate of the palace and stood on the steps. He looked at the 3 martial sages and said expressionlessly, "The palace is sealed by a divine level array. It is not something you can break. Don't waste your time." The 3 martial sages looked at each other and were unwilling to accept this. The white-haired old man said sternly, "Ji Tianqing, when we were in the East Sea, we heard about your name and deeds. We know that you are powerful. However, we are not cowards. We have also survived many trials and tribulations. No matter how powerful you are, you have to follow the rules of the underworld. We found this palace first. If you try to snatch it, you will be cutting off our wealth. Don't blame us for fighting with our lives." The other 2 old men in purple robes nodded in agreement. "That's right. First come, first served. Ji Tianqing, instead of wasting your time with us, why don't you go to the other palaces? You might be able to find more treasures." Ji Tianqing raised his eyebrows and sneered. "The rules of the underworld? I am the one who broke the seal of the illusory void secret land. According to you, the entire illusory void secret land belongs to me. Not only did you barge in without permission, but you also want to take away my wealth. Don't you deserve to die?" The three saints of the Eastern Sea stiffened, and their expressions turned ugly. You are twisting words and forcing logic." The white-haired old man, who was the leader, was holding a dark silver bow. He glared at Ji Tianqing with a fierce look, and shouted angrily, "Ji Tianqing, I don't want to argue with you. In short, this palace belongs to us, the three sages of the Eastern Sea. Even if we have to fight with our lives on the line and die here, we will never back down." The sneer on Ji Tianqing's face deepened. "Is that so?" I want to see just how powerful the three saints of the Eastern Sea are." As soon as he finished speaking, he suddenly raised his palms and shot out a dazzling golden light. Shua! The golden light condensed into 3 dragon claws the size of mountains. With the power to destroy the heavens and earth, they slammed down from the sky towards the 3 Eastern Sea saints. At this critical moment, the 3 saints of the Eastern Sea did not hesitate to counterattack. 7-star alignment! The white-haired old man roared. He held the bow in his left hand and plucked the bowstring with his right hand. Instantly, 7 silver light bullets were shot out. Shwa shwa! The 7 silver lights were linked together like shooting stars, piercing through the sky and illuminating hundreds of miles around. The 2 purple-robed old men also brandished their swords and sabers, slashing at the golden dragon claw in the sky with overwhelming saber light and sword shadows. In the next moment, the swords and the 7-star alignment hit the 3 dragon claws. Boom boom boom. In the deafening sound, the 7-star alignment and the swords were smashed into pieces. The huge golden dragon claws hit the 3 saints of the Eastern Sea and smashed into the square in front of the palace. Dong dong dong. 3 earth-shattering sounds burst out at the same time, shaking the sky. The huge square in front of the palace was smashed into a huge pit, and debris and dust flew everywhere. The 3 saints of the Eastern Sea were lying at the bottom of the pit. Half of their bodies were buried by dirt and rocks, and they looked very pathetic. The white-haired old man's chest caved in, and there were traces of blood on his chest. The 2 old men in purple robes were covered in blood, and blood kept flowing out of their noses and mouths. Dozens of bones in their bodies had been smashed into pieces. The 2 sides had only exchanged 1 blow, and Ji Tianqing was able to defeat the 3 saints of the Eastern Sea and injure them. The 3 of them were filled with fear. They ignored their injuries and hurriedly got up from the pit and ran away without looking back. Shwa shwa shwa. The strong desire to live drove the 3 of them to unleash their strongest power and cut across the sky like shooting stars. After 10 breaths, the 3 of them had flown a few hundred miles and disappeared into the forest to the west of the mountain range. Ji Tianqing didn't chase after them. He stood in the square in front of the palace and watched the 3 saints of the Eastern Sea escape with a playful smile on his face. So that's all you have. I overestimated you. Just a moment ago, the white-haired old man had vowed that he wouldn't give up on this palace, even if he had to fight to the death. In the blink of an eye, he forgot about those words and ran away without hesitation. How ironic! Yunyao also smiled and said calmly, "They've lived for a long time." The older they get, the more cautious they are and the more afraid they are of death. Dignity and integrity are not important in the face of death. Ji Tianqing nodded slightly and walked over the pit and ruins to the front of the palace. He used the Divine Eye secret technique and quickly saw through the defensive array of the palace. An hour later, he broke the seal and opened the door of the palace. He brought Yunyao into the palace, walked around the palace and looted a few 100 million worth of spirit stones, elixirs and materials. Although many of the elixirs were made 4,000 years ago, Nangong and the Divine Eye secret technique were still intact. But Nangong martial god had preserved it well, and the palace was sealed by a divine formation. Those elixirs were well preserved and their efficacy hadn't decreased much. Then Ji Tianqing and Yunyao went to the 5th and 6th mountains and looted the treasures in the palaces and pagodas. 2 hours later, the 2 of them went to the 7th mountain. During the flight, Ji Tianqing frowned as if he was deep in thought. Yunyao asked with telepathy, "Tianqing, what are you thinking about?" Ji Tianqing replied with telepathy, "There are 9 mountains in this mountain range. There are 9 palaces or pagodas, all of which store a large amount of cultivation resources. However, we've already looted 6 mountains and got more than 2 billion worth of cultivation resources, but we haven't even seen the shadow of a divine weapon. If you were martial god Nangong, where would you hide the divine weapon? Yunyao thought for a while and said, the 5th mountain is in the middle of the 9 mountains. It's also the core of the Yinyang layout. Just now we also saw that the palace on the mountain peak was indeed dazzling and magnificent, even more magnificent. Normally martial god Nangong would hide the divine weapon in that palace. Chapter 23-26. At this point Yunyao paused for a moment. She suddenly thought of something and frowned. Could it be that there's no divine artifact here? Or is this secret realm not Nangong martial god's cave abode? After all, the whole thing is a conspiracy of the Tianju divine nation. The Taihao divine nation spread the news that this is Nangong martial god's cave abode. It's very likely that the Tianju divine nation manipulated it. Ji Tianqing smiled and said with certainty, Yao Yao, your speculation is very reasonable. However, I'm sure that this secret realm is Nangong martial god's cave abode. The secret realm's sealing divine array, the heavenly cycle star array at the entrance, the secret realm's Yinyang layout, and the sealing arrays of the palaces are all divine arrays from 4,000 years ago. They can't be faked. Even Tianju martial god would find it difficult to set them up. Yunyao nodded in agreement and asked, since this is Nangong martial god's cave abode, where is the divine artifact that he made when he was alive? Ji Tianqing looked at the silver grassland to the east of the mountain range, and then at the endless forest to the west. A smile flashed in his eyes. If I'm not wrong, the divine artifact's hiding place should be related to the Yinyang layout. Yunyao immediately understood what he meant. Her eyes lit up. Then what are we waiting for? Let's go and check it out. Ji Tianqing waved his hand and chuckled. There's no hurry. A large number of martial saints have entered the secret realm. The situation is a bit chaotic. It won't be too late to look for the divine artifact after I've messed up the situation and dealt with those martial saints. As he spoke, he and Yunyao landed on the 7th mountain peak and landed outside of Vermilion Palace. There were 3 groups of martial artists confronting each other in the square in front of the palace. There were 4 or 5 people in each group, and half of them were martial saints. The 3 groups coveted the treasures in the palace, but none of them could get close to the palace gate. Everyone was holding swords and sabers. Violent battle intent was accumulating in their bodies. They were ready to fight. The atmosphere was a bit tense. The slightest movement would trigger a chaotic battle. Behind and to the side of the palace, there were 2 groups of warriors hiding in the forest. They all retracted their auras and cautiously approached the palace to study the palace's defensive array. There were a total of 5 groups of people, more than 30 martial artists, and they all had designs on this palace. Seeing this, Ji Tianqing revealed a playful smile. Looks like the competition is fierce. Yunyao said with a smile, fortunately, we were the first to come in. Previously we made an example of these people so they didn't dare to come close. Otherwise we would have to fight a fierce battle every time we plunder a palace. Ji Tianqing nodded and said with a playful smile, since these 5 groups of people are in a deadlock, I will give them a chance. What opportunity? Yunyao asked subconsciously. Ji Tianqing smiled but did not answer. He took her to the back of the palace. The 2 of them landed in a forest. 3,000 feet away was another group of cultivators. That group of cultivators had 8 people. The 2 leaders were martial saints, and the other 6 were martial lords. Seeing Ji Tianqing and Yunyao suddenly appear, that group of cultivators hurriedly retreated as if they were facing a great enemy. Ji Tianqing did not bother to pay attention to them. He focused on observing the defensive array, and then began to cast spells to break the array. He had already broken the array of the 6 palaces and the pagoda. He was very familiar with Nangong martial god's method of setting up arrays. In merely 45 minutes, he had cracked the grand array. Whoosh! Suddenly a wide gap appeared in the 5-colored light barrier that enveloped the palace walls, like a gate that was more than 20 feet tall. Ji Tianqing led Yunyao through the gap and entered the palace. The two of them split up and moved as fast as lightning in the palace, plundering the treasures as quickly as possible. In just 30 minutes, the couple had plundered 300 million worth of resources from the palace's secret rooms and treasure vaults. There were still about 200 million worth of cultivation resources left in the palace. They were all common items. They had purposely left them behind. Then, the two of them turned invisible and left the palace. Then a good show began. The 5 groups of cultivators outside the palace saw that the seal array had been opened. They hurriedly passed through the gap and swarmed into the palace. It was their first time entering the palace. Their minds were filled with treasures and divine artifacts. They were almost dizzy from excitement. However, they were not familiar with the layout of the palace. They ran around like headless flies and wasted a lot of time. When they found the secret rooms and treasures, they found that the others had also rushed over. As a result, the two groups of people inevitably came to blows in order to compete for cultivation resources. At first, the two groups of cultivators fought fiercely in the side palace. Not long after, the other two groups of cultivators met in the underground palace. They fought to the death for a few divine artifacts. The last group of cultivators was luckier. While the others were fighting, they plundered most of the treasures in the underground palace. However, when they sneaked out of the palace with the treasures, they were stopped by the other two groups of cultivators. Those two groups of cultivators were, of course, the victors of the battle. Although they all suffered different degrees of injuries, they were murderous and full of fighting spirit. The moment the two sides met, they started fighting without saying a word. The two groups of cultivators besieged the cultivators with the treasures. They fought until the sky fell and the earth cracked. After a quarter of an hour, the entire palace turned into ruins. Dust filled the sky. The result was without a doubt. The cultivators with the treasures were killed in a mess. More than half of the treasures were also snatched away. After this group of people was defeated miserably, only a few survivors escaped. The other two groups of cultivators moved the battlefield. In order to fight for the divine artifacts and treasures, they fought fiercely again. During this process, there were a few groups of cultivators who heard the fighting and rushed over to see what was going on. After they learned the truth, they also joined in the battle. They fought desperately for the divine artifacts and resources. Just like this, a chaotic battle that kept spreading began. Dozens of martial artists fought fiercely for a few saint artifacts and 200 million cultivation resources. And the instigator, Ji Tianqing, had long rushed to the 8th mountain peak with Yunyao. On this mountain peak there was a gilded pagoda. It was also sealed by a divine array. When Ji Tianqing and Yunyao arrived, there were a total of 6 groups of cultivators surrounding the pagoda. They were confronting each other with hostility. Everyone wanted to be the first to enter the pagoda and plunder all the treasures and resources. However, no one could break the divine array. Everyone was in a stalemate. Seeing this, Ji Tianqing used the same trick again. He broke the defensive array of the pagoda. Then, he and Yunyao entered the pagoda first and plundered the pagoda as fast as they could. The two of them plundered more than half of the resources in the pagoda. They only left about 30% of the resources for the 6 groups of cultivators outside the pagoda to fight for. This matched the cultivators' initial thoughts. Chapter 23-27. Half an hour later, Ji Tianqing and Yunyao left the pagoda. The 6 groups of warriors had already rushed into the pagoda like wolves and tigers. After a while, they started a chaotic battle in the pagoda. In order to fight for some sacred grade Dharma treasures and cultivation resources, they did not hesitate to risk their lives. The battle lasted for 15 minutes, and the entire pagoda was destroyed and turned into ruins. The 6 groups of warriors suffered heavy casualties, but they did not get many benefits. Following that, the martial artists who carried the treasures were hunted down and surrounded by other martial artists. A fierce chase and chaotic battle unfolded in the mountain range. At this time, Ji Tianqing rushed to the 9th mountain peak and created another chaotic battle. In this chaos, he and Yunyao plundered resources worth hundreds of millions. leaving only a few sacred-grade Dharma treasures and a bunch of sacred-grade Dharma treasures. For groups of warriors were drawn into the vortex of fighting, and the chaotic battle began. Ji Tianqing and Yunyao left quietly and flew to the silver plains east of the mountain range. During the flight, Yunyao looked back a few times. She sighed with emotion when she saw the lights flashing above the mountain range and the loud noises shaking the sky. Those people are so pitiful. They are fighting for the leftovers, but they don't know that the biggest benefits have been taken by us. Ji Tianqing raised his eyebrows and said calmly, so what? If I didn't break those divine arrays, they wouldn't even be able to enter the illusory sky secret realm, let alone get any benefits. The people of the heaven and divine nation are eyeing us covetously. They must be plotting revenge. More than a dozen groups of warriors entered the secret realm. They are really a hindrance, so I can only get rid of them first. Yunyao nodded and looked at the silver plains below. She asked, Tianqing, do you think there are divine-grade Dharma treasures in this grassland full of star grass and silver rice flowers? Ji Tianqing thought for a while and said seriously, this idea seems absurd, but it has an unexpected effect. However, this is just my guess and I can't be sure. After we investigate it, we will know the answer. Subsequently, both of them released their divine senses and began to investigate the situation on the grassland. The formless divine sense enveloped a radius of 1,000 miles and penetrated deep into the ground, not letting go of a single spot. Even the rocks and ants deep underground could not escape the senses of the two of them. Time passed quietly. Unknowingly, for hours had passed. Ji Tianqing and Yunyao explored a radius of 10,000 miles but found nothing. Not only was there no aura of a divine artifact, there wasn't even the slightest clue about it. However, the two of them discovered something interesting. The three sages of the Eastern Sea, who had been injured by Ji Tianqing, were actually plucking stargrass and silver rice flowers on this grassland. Those two kinds of flowers and plants were both medicinal herbs used in alchemy. One stalk could be exchanged for several spirit stones. Although the price wasn't high, there were so many of them. If he could pick a few million flowers and plants, he could sell them for tens of millions of spirit stones. Ji Tianqing was very puzzled. The three sages of the Eastern Sea were respectable people. Why would they be interested in these lowly plants? After taking a closer look, he finally understood what was going on. It turned out that the three sages of the Eastern Sea's injuries were even more miserable, and their strength was also quite weak. Judging from their sorry state, it was obvious that they had gone through several fierce battles. Ji Tianqing immediately guessed that the three sages of the Eastern Sea must have also participated in the chaotic battle to try to snatch resources and treasures. However, the three old men suffered losses in the chaotic battle and did not reap any benefits. In desperation, they could only pick medicinal herbs on the grassland. At least there was some compensation. They couldn't return empty-handed with serious injuries, right? When the three sages of the Eastern Sea discovered Ji Tianqing, they were obviously shocked and hurriedly turned to flee. Ji Tianqing laughed when he saw this. He was too lazy to chase after them. Not long after, he and Yunyao flew near the lake and stopped in midair to rest. The lake under their feet had a radius of a few thousand miles. The lake water was dark green. Layers of ripples appeared on the surface of the lake when the breeze blew. Looking down from the sky, the entire lake was like a huge dark green gem, embedded in the silver ground. Ji Tianqing stared at the dark green lake. After a moment of careful observation, he suddenly frowned. No, there's something wrong with this lake. Yunyao turned to look at him and asked, what's wrong? Ji Tianqing frowned and said, logically speaking, a normal lake should be clear and bright like a mirror. However, this lake is dark green. There must be something wrong with the water quality, or the bottom of the lake has been tampered with. However, I've checked the water quality. It's normal and even contains rich spiritual energy. The bottom of the lake is also normal. There's nothing wrong with it. However, the more normal it is, the more abnormal it is. Yunyao suddenly understood. She said with a burning gaze, you mean trying to cover it up will only make it more conspicuous? That's right. Ji Tianqing nodded and said with a smile, I'm sure that martial god Nangong has spent a lot of effort on this lake. Then let's dive to the bottom of the lake and take a look. Yunyao looked expectant. However, at this moment, 2 dazzling lights suddenly flew in the sky behind them. Swoosh! Swoosh! In the blink of an eye, the 2 dazzling lights pierced through the sky and arrived in front of them. After the dazzling lights faded, 2 tall figures were revealed. The middle-aged man on the left was wearing a purple robe. He had long white hair and a purple sword mark on his forehead. The man on the right was wearing a black robe and a cloak that covered his face. Ji Tianxing, we meet again. The man in the purple robe sneered and his eyes were filled with cold killing intent. Ji Tianxing and Yuniao turned around and raised their eyebrows when they saw the man in the purple robe. Yilu Shui? You're really here. The corner of Ji Tianxing's mouth curled into a sneer, and his eyes turned cold. When he first met Yuan Zhan and the martial sages of the Heaven End Holy Nation, he knew that Yilu Shui would not stay out of this. He must have been involved in this conspiracy. Now that Yilu Shui had appeared, his guess was confirmed. He then looked at the man in the black robe beside Yilu Shui. After sensing his aura, he sneered, Wu Duantian, since you're here, why are you still hiding? The man in the black robe jerked and took off his cloak, revealing his face. It was Wu Duantian. He looked at Ji Tianxing and mocked himself, as expected of the Kenshin. These disguises are useless in front of you. They're just a joke. Ji Tianxing glanced at Wu Duantian and Yilu Shui and said, You want to kill me with just the 2 of you? You're too naive. The rest of you don't have to hide anymore. Come out. Yilu Shui's face changed and he frowned. However, after hesitating for a while, he waved his hand. Then, a few surges of spiritual force came out from the silver grassland in all directions. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. A total of 6 martial sages emerged from the ground and flew up to the sky to hover in the air. There were men and women among the 6 martial sages, and they had different figures and appearances. There were even 2 martial sages who were dressed strangely. You're tuning in to the Li Mei Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.